Okay, come on.
What I'll do is good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Government Oversight Committee meeting. Thank you all for coming. I think we'll be best the rush hour traffic to be here this morning. And we're going to start with committee introduction, starting on my far left with Senator Desjardins.
Thank you and good morning. I am Senator Desjardins, Senate District 24, which we all know is beautiful downtown in scenic Brunswick, the rolling hills of Pownell, the working waterfront community of Hartsville, the shopping and natural resource mecca of Freeport, and recently added great village of North Yarmouth.
That's all the time we had for today. I'm Rep. Mike McClellan. You might not know I live in Raymond, and I serve House Seat 66, which you might not know is parts of Raymond, Casco, and Poland.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bill Diamond. I represent Senate District 26, in Raymond, Casco, Standish, Baldwin, and Fire Island. I'm glad to be here.
Good morning. My name is Paul Davis. I represent Senate District 4, which is all of Piscataquis County, and the blue town is both Penobscot and Somerset County. And you could put Senator Gillespie's district in one column.
Thank you. I represent Bob Duchesne, House District 121. I actually share part of that beautiful part of Penobscot County, the town of Alton, with Senator Davis, also Argyle, Hudson, Torrance, and Milford.
Good morning, Chuck Kruger from Thomaston, also representing other towns in District 92, including St. George, South Thomaston, Cushing, Matinicus, Creehaven, and I've also just added Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic.
I'm Dave Burns. I represent Senate District number 6, which is part of coastal Hancock County.
Good morning, I'm Anne Marie Mastracchio. I represent House District 18, which is part of the city of Sanford.
I'm Jim Campbell. I represent District 130, which is
Good morning, this is Senator Chris Johnson. I represent mostly Lincoln County, Senate District 13, the coast from the lovely offshore islands and rivers and peninsulas all the way into the inland towns of Windsor and Washington and Summit.
Good morning, I'm Deb Sanderson. I represent House District 88, which is Chelsea, Whitefield, Jefferson, and the northern part of Norfolk.
Thank you. I'm Roger Cates. I represent Augusta, Oakland, China, Sydney, and Vasco in the Maine Senate. And we're also joined here today by our Director, Beth Ashcroft, our wonderful staffer, Etta Connors, and also Matt Crook from the PAGR as well, who's worked hard on this matter. And also here somewhere is Linda. Here's Linda back there, the Deputy Attorney General. He's been an assistant to us as well. So the purpose of being here today is to gather additional details and understanding of the events, communications, explanations, and impacts described in OPEGA's information brief on state funding for Good Will-Hinckley. There are 3 statutes relevant to the inquiry being conducted by us in this matter, which we will follow. Those are statutes governing the Legislative Investigating Committee statute, the OPEGA statute, and also the Freedom of Access law. We've conferred with Deputy Attorney General Pissner on how those statutes relate to each other and which government proceedings we are conducting. The first thing we need to do is to talk about whether the testimony today should be taken under oath or not. With respect to the 2 witnesses we have subpoenaed, the answer is yes, because the statute calls for that. But there are a number of other witnesses we have invited to be here today. And the question for the committee to discuss is whether or not that testimony should also be taken under oath, or whether 2 witnesses should get under oath and the rest not under oath. So I'll open that for discussion. Senator Burns.
Thank you, Senator Cates. I listen thought, and I think that we're going to do it for one, we should do it for all today. So I would recommend that everyone who speaks today
Is that a motion, Senator? Moved by Senator Jones, seconded by Representative Kruger, that all testimony today be under oath. Is there discussion with respect to the motion? Representative Sanderson.
Thank you. For the individuals who just received a letter requesting that they come speak to us so we could have the opportunity to answer questions, I believe in that letter there isn't any mention of having them have to be under oath. I feel a little funny about that now, all of a sudden deciding as a committee we are going to put them under oath. So I just wanted to put that.
Yeah.
Senator Gates, I just would remind you that in addition to the letter, all the individuals that were invited to attend also received a communication regarding the statutes that were going to be governing this proceeding, including the full legislative investigating committee statute, which describes and discusses these points of procedure that the committee would need to determine. So while there was not express statement of whether or not that would happen, certainly they were given opportunity to review the fact that it would come up for discussion.
Further discussion, Senator Diamond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think that it would make any difference whether we're on the oath or not, and because I think we get the same information. So therefore, I think if we were starting with the first two, I think it would be consistent to do it with all.
Further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion to take all testimony under oath, please indicate by raising your hand. Those opposed? I believe it is 11-1 with Representative Sanderson being the minority, so all testimony will be under oath. The next thing for us to discuss is the order of procedure for today, which we need to vote on, which I'm going to suggest in just a moment. But before I do, let me mention that this room is very crowded and that there is an overflow room, which is the Health and Human Services Committee room, which I believe is 209 down the hall here. So if anybody listening who would like to come down, there is that overflow room. So let me go through the kind of rules of the game for today, and we'll need a motion to adopt these unless we have objections to any specific ones. First of all proceedings and testimony will be held in public session and will be broadcast over the internet and available through televising and filming as is normal protocol and required under the Freedom of Access law. With the exception of possible executive sessions for the purpose of the GOC consulting with our attorney on our legal rights and duties under Title I, Section 405 and 6E, or for other purposes allowed under Title III, Chapter 21. Next, all subpoenaed witnesses and now all witnesses will be placed under oath prior to the taking of their testimony. Next, all witnesses will then provide any records they have with them prior to testimony being taken. The testimony will be taken in the following order: Aaron Chadbourne, Cynthia Montgomery, Thomas Desjardins, Susan Bodwin, Rich Abramson, Sarah Vanderwood, Jay Nutting, William Brown, and Gregory Powell. Next, all questions to the witnesses will come from GOC members, Government Oversight Committee members, or staff. In this case, our Director, Beth Ashcroft. Any staff questions will be posed through the chairs and leads, unless the chair directs otherwise. There will be no opportunity for questioning the witnesses by other witnesses or their counsel. After all testimony is taken, the Government Oversight Committee will provide an opportunity for any witnesses to offer further or clarifying information they may wish to offer. After all testimony is taken, the committee may recall particular witnesses' further questions. So those are the suggested rules of how we proceed today. Is there a motion with respect to those?
So
Moved by Senator Diamond, seconded by Senator Davis. Is there any discussion of that? Seeing none, all in favor of that order of procedure, please so indicate. Opposed? It's unanimous. Each witness will take in order as I indicated, and Each witness will be offered an opportunity at the beginning to make a brief statement if they wish to, prior to any questions by the committee. The first thing we want to do, though, is to hear from our director briefly, because each of these witnesses, as part of either the subpoena or the request to appear, was asked to produce any documents which might be relevant to this matter. I don't go through the list of what those are, but we did ask them to bring documents. For some of them, it was documents in addition to what they otherwise might have provided before today. But for some of them, it was just the first time. So, as is consistent with our practice, those documents have been produced or will be produced this morning. Beth has had a chance to review the ones which have already been produced, and I'm going to ask her if she could brief us on whether those new documents have cast an additional light on the facts that we're looking into today.
First of all of those that are going to be with you today have provided documents in advance, with the exception of Jay Nutting, so that we appreciate that. That was very helpful. It was an opportunity to review them for you prior to today. As by virtue of that, I've told those folks that they did not need to bring hard copies of those documents with them to give to today. I don't think that would be a particularly useful for you at this particular time. We can discuss after we've spoken with folks whether there are particular documents you'd like for OPEGA to bring forward for you. But the overview of them is that nearly all the documents that we received were either documents we had already obtained as part of our review from other sources, so that a number of them were not anything new and therefore are reflected in the information brief to the degree that they're part of the story. There were a few documents that provided us additional level of support for particular dates or times that things happened that have been described to you in the brief, and others that were related to things that we already knew. So I guess I would just then talk about the couple of things that I think would be relevant to your questioning today that we are not reflected somehow in detail here. And the first would be on page 14 of the brief. At the very bottom of that page, we had reported to you that the Good Will-Hinckley board chair had told us that he had a conversation with, would be Mr. Chadbourne, where Mr. Moore was informed that the lawyer would like to speak with him. We do have email chain now that suggests that that lawyer was Ms. Montgomery, and that there was a meeting set up between she and Mr. Moore that was supposed to be for July 23rd. She had to reschedule, and we don't have any further information about whether that meeting was actually held or not. So that, I know one of you or more had a question about whether that meeting took place and what that was about, so we did get a little extra around that. And then there was additionally an email from Commissioner Desjardins to Ms. Montgomery asking about whether or not he should provide OPEGA with a couple of additional points of information following his interview with us. I believe probably his first interview with us. And so it was asking her if she thought that it would be good to pass on these other points of information to us or not, checking in with her on that. Other than that, there was really nothing in the documents that we got that I think would relate to your interview today.
Okay, any questions, Beth, with respect to that? Seeing none, any other business to come before us before we begin?
I would just let committee members know that there is a highlighted copy similar to the one that I sent you here on the table in case you want to refer those that you're speaking with to any particular pages in that document. There's one for you. And the only other thing I would say is I apologize in advance if we have to ask people to step out of the room, but we were advised after our last meeting that there is a capacity limit on the room, and so there is an overflow room, and we may need to ask people to adhere to that if that becomes necessary.
you're gonna sit over there. All right. Anything else, ladies and gentlemen? Why don't we get started then? And the first person we've asked to be here is Aaron Chadbourne. Mr. Chadbourne? And he is here with his attorney, Cliff Ruprecht. Morning. 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 Raise your right hand. Do you promise the testimony, affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I absolutely do.
Thank you. I'm going to start with some questions from Mr. Chadbourne, and other committee members may have some as well. So thank you for being here this morning. The first question I have is, there was a June 5th meeting.
I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chadbourne had an opening statement.
Well, I apologize. We did say we afforded that opportunity, and please go ahead, sir.
You did, and I thank you for that, Senator. Senator Cates, Representative Kruger, and members of the Government Oversight Committee. I did want to take an opportunity briefly to introduce myself. I know that I've obviously appeared before several of you in your other committees, but there are a number of you that I've not yet met. My name is Aaron Chadbourne, and I serve as Senior Policy Advisor to the Governor, a position that I've only held for about 9 months. And it's a position that I consider a great honor. I grew up in Gorham, Maine, graduated from Gorham High School. I left Maine to attend Harvard for college. I know Senator Cates' alma mater. Also went to law school and business school, and then moved away to pursue a career helping companies and organizations grow and succeed. Around the time the governor was reelected, I was contemplating leaving the global strategy firm where I worked, and I looked into whether there were any interesting opportunities that would enable me to move back to Maine to be close to my family. By complete happenstance, I had coffee with a former member of Governor Baldacci's office, and he suggested that I reach out to this governor and let him know if I'd be willing to work to help get things done in Maine, because we have a lot of work to do to improve our state's economy, education system, and competitiveness to ensure Maine is on a path to prosperity. And that's how I came to sit before you today. Now, despite what we hear in the BDN, the initiative that I've been most publicly associated with to date was presenting the governor's proposed constitutional amendment to eliminate the state income tax, which in any other year might have been enough to catch the newspaper's attention, but I've gathered that this year is an exception. In addition to working on tax policy, my portfolio of responsibility is diverse, including education policy. And it's my involvement with education policy on behalf of the governor that caused me to be witness to some of the events described in the OPEGA report, which I'd like to comment on briefly. First, it's my opinion that the OPEGA report is thorough, and I believe that it documents well the series of events that took place concerning your subject of interest. Now, there are a few places where I disagree with the characterization that the authors of the report used, but overall, I think the underlying timeline and series of events is relatively accurate, and it satisfies OPEGA's fact-finding charge, which is why I have not found a need to comment on it before today. Second, I'm here today voluntarily. I've heard many people speculate that the governor's office might challenge your subpoena in court. However, I believe that doing so would only prolong the media's interest in this matter and the distraction it creates for the public and the hardworking men and women in state Maine government. We have other important things to focus on. So I'm happy to help satisfy the committee's inquiry and truthfully answer your questions where I have direct knowledge of the facts you are interested in finding. At your last meeting, Director Ashcroft made the suggestion that some witnesses might want to be subpoenaed in order to be protected from retribution. I want to assure you that is not the case for me. I have not discussed the content of my testimony with the governor, and the only thing he's ever said to me about being in front of you is that I should tell the truth. And that's what I'm here to do today. And in doing so, I hope to put an end to much of the unwarranted speculation that has surrounded my role in these events, or my willingness to cooperate with your fact-finding. In actuality, I'm eager for your fact-finding to conclude, and I welcome the committee's questions about any facts that I might have witnessed so that I can provide the clarification that you need to complete this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Chadbourne, there was a June 5th meeting that Commissioner Desjardins had with the governor regarding the logger training initiative. Were you at that meeting?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. And you privy to a briefing memo that was done prior to that meeting? I guess the acting commissioner prepared?
Yes.
And in that briefing memo, the acting commissioner indicated that Speaker Reeves had actually been hired and was about to begin on July 1. Is that true?
I believe in the memo, the acting commissioner at the time indicated that they had made a selection. I don't believe he mentioned Speaker Reeves at all, and the first time I heard of it was during the meeting.
But a selection had been made, is that right?
You have the letter before you, Senator. I don't have it with me.
What did the commissioner tell you and the governor about that, at that meeting, about the speaker being hired?
Well, the commissioner indicated that, as in his memo, that a president had been hired, and the governor said, you didn't say who it is in your memo, and asked who it was. He said, it's the Speaker of the House, Mark Eves.
And what was the governor's reaction?
I think his jaw dropped. He was very surprised. He was very surprised by that statement. And I think his instant reaction was something to the effect of, what does Mark Eves know about running a school for at-risk kids? The governor talked a lot about at-risk kids in that moment. He talked about his brothers, and he tried to picture what his brothers would do in that school and whether that was the appropriate leadership that they would need, and he voiced his concern that it wasn't. He asked a little bit about what qualifications Mark Eves might have had that would lead to such a selection, and he was just overwhelmingly puzzled. He also asked me a question, which I went and researched afterwards, about whether or not it was permissible under law, which it's not my role to provide legal guidance to the governor, so I took that question to Sarah Forrester, but whether it's permissible under law for a member of the legislature to be employed by a charter school that receives its funding directly from the state.
And this was also at that first meeting?
Correct.
As far as you know, sir, was that the first time the governor had learned about the speaker's hiring?
Yes, and by the surprise look on his face and his reaction, I take it to be the first time.
Was there any discussion at that first meeting about Good Will-Hinckley's funding?
No.
And what, if anything, did the governor ask you or the commissioner to do at that meeting?
Other than that one inquiry to find out whether or not it was permitted under law for a sitting member of the legislature to be employed by an organization receiving this funding from the state, nothing more.
Is there anyone else at that meeting as you recall?
No.
By the way, for your benefit and for the benefit of everybody else, the reason there are going to be so many questions directed to you and Ms. Montgomery in particular is because you were not interviewed before by the UTECA staff. So a lot of the background we might already have, we don't have, so that's why it takes a little while. What is your understanding of what the governor did next with respect to this issue after that meeting, sir?
I don't know that I have any other information on what's provided in the OPEGA report. There's nothing that I would characterize differently.
Apparently, the governor called the acting president of Good Will-Hinckley, Rich Abramson, on June 5th. Were you were aware of that call?
Only from reading in your report and the characterizations publicly.
Did the governor ever discuss that call with you at any time before or after?
No.
Were you aware of the governor's call to Greg Powell of the Harold Alphon Foundation also on June 5th?
Again, not at the time, no.
And did the governor ever discuss that call with you at some later time?
I've only heard the governor characterize it in his public comments. It might come as a surprise to members of this committee, but the governor has said much more about this matter publicly than he has privately.
So what did you hear him say in any form?
About
the call to Mr. Powell?
Again, I've just heard him publicly acknowledge that he did call him.
Did you have any other meetings, Mr. Chadbourne, with the governor on the subject of the speaker's hiring in the period between June 5th and June 8th, do you recall? The June 8th cabinet meeting is June 9th. Is there any discussions with the governor before the cabinet meeting that you've not already?
Before the cabinet meeting, the only interaction I had with the governor on the matter pertained to the formal letter that we were preparing to send to Jack Moore that we submitted to him on June 8th.
Okay, and tell us about those discussions if you can.
The only discussion that we had is that it was his desire to send a letter to Chairman Jack Moore. I believe in my conversation with Sarah Vanderwood, she had asked whether the governor might want to speak to Mr. Moore. I asked the governor whether he would be interested in speaking to Mr. Moore. He said no. I decided we'll send him a letter so that he knows that I have concerns with the selection that they made, and I don't find Mark disqualified. I suggested some of what we might put in that letter, and that's what we worked on.
Okay. Sarah Vanderwood was a person who was employed as a lobbyist by Good Will-Hinckley around this time period, is that right?
Correct, and for a while before that.
And you had at least one meeting with her, or perhaps more. I'd like you to walk us through those if you could.
Sure. After my meeting with the governor, I think the first thing I did was actually come to the Attorney General's office to speak with Sarah Forrester to research the question of law. But upon returning to my office, I called Sarah Vanderwood and I asked her to stop by my office. My intention in that conversation was to ask her whether she had any information about the whether someone had been indeed selected as President Good Will-Hinckley. I hadn't heard about it previously, and it's been my experience that a number of the schools, the university, and the college system, they tend to reach out to me to make sure the governor's aware when they've made a selection. It's common practice and I think a courtesy, and quite often they're looking to make sure that he has confidence in who they've selected. That had not occurred at this time, so I called Sarah Vanderwood in an attempt to confirm what Acting Commissioner Desjardins had told the governor, and she said she had no knowledge of that and she'd get back to me.
Is that at anybody's directive that you reached out to her?
No, it was at my own attempt to verify the information I heard them.
Did Ms. Vanderwood, if you know, go ahead and contact the school and get back to you with respect to?
I think she came back to see me again later that afternoon with information.
Tell us about that meeting.
Sarah Vanderwood came and said that she had looked into it. It's not something she had heard about. I think she was surprised to learn of it. And I think at the time I said, okay. I let her know that the governor had expressed concerns about Speaker Eve's qualifications. Didn't think that he was qualified, and was particularly concerned about whether this decision had been made in the best interest of the students at Good Will-Hinckley.
From the report, we've learned that her impression from meeting with you was that the funding for Good Will-Hinckley School would now be in jeopardy if the speaker were hired. I'm sure you read that in the report.
It did.
Okay, and what was there in your discussion with her that would have led her to that conclusion?
I think the question that she asked me most directly was whether I thought the governor would still be willing to speak at their commencement, and I said I couldn't confirm that at that time. I thought he might not want to. She said that she knew that Glenn Cummings would be speaking at the commencement as well, and wondered if that was a concern. I let her know that no, the governor had a lot of confidence in Glenn Cummings and in his leadership of the school, and I did not see that as a concern. However, I did think the governor had now concerns about the management of the school, and he might not wish to attend their commencement.
Well, she left the meeting with the impression that the funding of the school was in jeopardy. What did you say that led her to that conclusion?
You'd have to ask her that question, sir. I don't know what created a depression for Sarah Vanderwood. I was relatively new to the governor's office at the time. I was not familiar with the details of the funding for Good Will-Hinckley, and so anything that she may have inferred from my comments was not a direct result of things that I said. The funding at no time came up, and so you'd have to ask Sarah Vanderwood about that.
Did anybody suggest to you that you convey a message to her that in any way the funding for Good Will-Hinckley would now be in jeopardy?
Never. Nor to anyone else. I've never been asked to convey a message to anyone, whether at Good Will-Hinckley or elsewhere, about the funding and being in jeopardy. It's never been suggested to me.
That's never been suggested that you do that?
No one's ever directed me to or asked me to.
Have you done that?
No.
Did you have any other communications or meetings with her in the period before the cabinet meeting that we've not already talked about?
Not that I recall. There may have been incidental communication. I had asked her at one point for contact information from Mr. Moore in anticipation of sending him a letter. And I think she and I communicated about whether, I think over the phone, about whether or not the governor might be willing to speak with him.
The report also indicated on the morning of June 5th that the acting commissioner was called back to the governor's office, and that he then called Mr. Moore, the Good Will-Hinckley board chair. Were you aware of that phone call?
I was not aware of the phone call. A number of things were happening that morning, Senator, and I wasn't in the governor's office for all of them. I do remember being out of the office, being back in the office, and the acting commissioner being generally around. I don't believe that he met with the governor, as I'm generally present when he's met with the governor.
Did the commissioner ever, I'm going to call him the commissioner ever discuss that phone call with you?
He may have, but not in a significant way that I recall.
You don't recall anything he might have told you about that call?
Not particularly. There were a lot of conversations taking place at that point, and that doesn't stand out to me.
Okay. When did you become aware that the governor had written a handwritten note to Mr. Moore, the chair of the board of Good Will-Hinckley?
I suspect it was when you became aware of it, when it was first reported in the press.
Okay. You don't recall any knowledge of it before that?
I recall that I had no knowledge of it before that.
Any other meetings that you had with Commissioner Desjardins on June 5th or at any time before that June cabinet meeting that we haven't talked about?
The acting commissioner and I were in constant communication. This is one of very many issues that were before the governor's office at the time. As you all recall, it was the end of session. The budget had not closed yet. The committee that you sit on, Senator Cates, had not yet issued its majority and minority reports. So there were many issues that I was in contact with Commissioner Desjardins. So I couldn't recall for you every one of them.
The commissioner, Desjardins, has told us, the staff, that he believed you were present during a conversation that he had with the governor, when the governor told him that he didn't want to send Good Will-Hinckley any funding that was not required by law. Do you recall being present at that meeting?
I do.
Okay, and do you recall when that was?
I don't recall specifically, but I've looked at my calendar in anticipation you asked me that question. The best guess that I have for you of when that conversation may have taken place would have been following the cabinet meeting. The governor had previously scheduled a meeting with Commissioner Desjardins to discuss a teacher certification issue related to a specific school because a constituent had reached out to him, and that was on the calendar immediately following the cabinet meeting. And I believe it was at that meeting where the conversation took place.
Okay, can you tell us, as you recall, who was there and what was said?
It was within the governor's office, myself, the acting commissioner, and the governor. And it was not at all a focal point of the conversation. I think it was an incidental comment made as the commissioner and I were leaving the room. I think the acting commissioner made a comment about the governor's past advocacy for more funding for Good Will-Hinckley, and I can't recall the exact substance of that. And that was at the point that the governor very clearly said, well, after the budget is passed, I want you to read it carefully, and we'll give them exactly what we're required by law. And
thank you. In the last paragraph on page 14 of the report, there was reference to at least two conversations you had with Mr. Moore. Again, Mr. Moore is the chair of the Good Will-Hinckley board. I'd like to walk through those with you if I could. I think you reached out to Mr. Moore, is that true?
Yes.
And what was your purpose in doing so?
On June 8th, which is the first date, so let me give you both dates first. The first date of our conversation was June 8th.
Let me stop just for a second. Had anybody's directed you on Mr. Moore, or was that your decision?
It was my decision.
Go ahead, thank you.
And my decision on June 8th, and the second conversation, I actually don't have a specific date for you. I think it was immediately before the 4th of July, because he had mentioned he was going fly fishing for the weekend. But that was just to let him know that I was providing his contact information to Cynthia Montgomery, and she might be contacting him, given that there was pending litigation. It was a pretty conversation sometime in July. On June 8th, my purpose for calling him Senator was to let him know that I had spoken with Sarah Vanderwood prior to the weekend. She had indicated he might like to meet with the governor, and I had given her the indication he might be willing to meet. I wanted to let him know the governor had decided that he'd instead send him a letter outlining his concerns with their selection of the speaker, and that the governor had hoped that they would continue the selection process. Now, at that point in time, we had just been through a selection process at the University of Maine at Orono, which did not result in a final candidate. They extended the search process for a year. I think a similar decision was made at Maine Community College. So it was a process that I was familiar with, people extending the presidential search process until they found someone. It was at that time that Mr. Moore indicated that, I think in this conversation, Mr. Moore, because I didn't speak to him after that, indicated to me that I think the speaker had signed a contract over the weekend. And I said, well, it sounds like the board has made its decision, and there's nothing really more to speak about.
Have you told us everything you know, Mr. Moore, about the governor's reaction to the news of the speaker being hired?
The conversation was longer than that, and I think the basis of our conversation, I think I laid out the objections in the governor's letter. I spent a lot of time discussing with him Speaker Eves' perceived lack of qualification by the governor to serve as the president of Good Will-Hinckley. He asked whether or not, I think this is what he says in the report, he asked whether or not he's objecting because he was a Democrat. I let him know that Glenn Cummings, he thought was very qualified, had a great background prior to being selected to lead that school. He was not objecting because he's a Democrat. I think there were many other people the governor could suggest, and it wasn't on the basis of political party or politics. It was because the governor was most concerned about finding the right leader for that school. The school is relatively new and being established as a charter school, and their funding situation has not been self-sustaining to date. And he wanted to make sure that the leader there had strong management experience and a strong educational background that would best serve those kids.
That's what you told Mr. Moore?
Absolutely, yes.
Mr. Moore left that conversation, sir, with the impression that the funding for Good Will-Hinckley is now in jeopardy. Did you tell him that?
I did not.
And this is now the second person who leaves a conversation with you believing that the funding for Good Will-Hinckley is now in jeopardy because of a hiring decision. What did you say to him that led him to that conclusion?
If I read your report correctly, Senator, I take a couple of things. First, both of those witnesses told you that I never brought up the funding situation. I'm telling you now, I didn't even know about the extra $530,000 that was in the budget because it's not a part of the budget that I worked on before it had been submitted. It's not a part of the budget that I reviewed or worked on when it was before the legislature. It's not something I was aware of. Now, What is clear from your report is it's something that was very front of mind for those individuals. So if Sarah Vanderwood, a lobbyist who's hired to look for any indication that that funding might be in jeopardy, thought that the governor not speaking at their commencement was such an indication, I can't speak to anything other than that.
So we have now two folks who came away from conversations with you thinking the funding was in jeopardy, and you can think of nothing you said that you either.
I told them the governor disapproved of their selection.
Question. You can't think of anything that you said which led either of those people to conclude that the funding was now in jeopardy, sir?
I think I've been completely forthcoming with you, Senator Cates, in the fact that I told them the governor disapproved with the management's selection they made for their school. What conclusions they drew from that is a question you have to ask them. But I did not at any time reference the funding, nor was I aware of the extraordinary funding that this is the only school that receives this type of funding outside of the charter school.
Now, on June 5th, when there was some talk, by someone at least, about withholding Good Will-Hinckley's funding, did you know that Good Will-Hinckley had an active grant agreement with the Alphon Foundation?
I did not.
When did you first learn of that, if you recall?
I believe as it was reported in the press I think it was just before the speaker's terminated his contract. It was reported in the press.
Do you know when and how the governor first learned that the Harold Alphon Foundation continued funding in future years might be in jeopardy?
I do not know that, sir.
Were you present, Mr. Chadbourne, at the cabinet meeting on June 9th?
Yes.
Can you tell us what was... Sorry. $10, Mr. Merrill?
Sorry. I think he's giving you back for not giving him credit for getting the exclusive on the speaker's side.
I'm going to ask him about that one. All right. I want to ask you about that meeting. And can you tell us, in addition to the cabinet members, generally who was there?
I don't think the audience differed from a typical cabinet meeting.
Staff, senior staff?
And I imagine some of them are missing. I'm not sure, but the general team, senior staff.
Okay. Tell us what you recall about what was discussed at that meeting about the Good Will-Hinckley matter.
To be perfectly honest with you, until I read it in the report, it was not something that I distinctly remembered. I vaguely remember the governor making a side throwaway comment about the fact that Speaker Eves now wanted to run a charter school. And I do recall acting commissioner at the time, Tom Desjardins, saying, "Oh, we'll see how that goes by the end of the day." I think that was the extent of the conversation as it pertained to that matter.
Sorry, what was that last part about?
As reported in the UPA report, Commissioner Desjardins did make a comment saying, "We'll see if that's still the case by the end of the day," because as your report indicates, I think you believe that the decision.
The decision.
Again, it's in your report. I don't know.
Sorry, I just couldn't hear what you said. The decision had been made.
Might change. I
see.
think he was saying, again, I'll refer you to the report.
Do you recall the governor giving anyone any instructions or directives about doing anything at that cabinet?
No.
Were you involved in any way, sir, in the decision to withhold the first quarter payment to Good Will-Hinckley that happened on June 9th?
No, and I was not aware that it happened until I was contacted by the media or our press office was.
Have you now learned whether the governor or whether anyone else in his office was involved in making that decision?
I am confident that no one other than the commissioner was involved in making the decision.
When did you first learn about the commissioner's decision to withhold?
It was, I'd have to check my documents for the date at which we received the inquiry in late June from a reporter about it. That was the first I heard.
Do you know how the governor learned that it came to
I do not, and I do not recall discussing it with him.
Mr. Chadbourne, other than the interactions and communications we've already discussed here this morning, were there any additional interactions, communications that you sir, had with anybody at Good Will-Hinckley, at the school of Good Will-Hinckley, or were there attorneys at any time regarding the matter of the speaker being hired and the issue of the funding?
The only two interactions or conversations I had that I did not see reflected in the report were Monday, June 8th. I attended an event at the University of Maine at Augusta and was approached by former President Good Will-Hinckley, at the time interim president of the University of Augusta, and now the president of the University of Southern Maine, Glenn Cummings. We were there to sign an agreement between the University of Maine system and the Maine Community College system on credit transfer. Mr. Cummings mentioned to me that he heard that the governor didn't approve of their selection of Mark Eves to run the school. I said, right, it doesn't believe that he's qualified. And Glenn Cummings said, well, you know, there are other folks at the school that the governor can have confidence in. And that was the extent of that conversation.
Thank you. Do you recall any other interactions or communications with the governor or others in the governor's office on this subject of Good Will-Hinckley?
No, but to answer your first question, I said there were two instances. The first was Glenn Cummings, and the second was Speaker Eves. Speaker Eves stopped me in the parking lot. He pulled up his car beside me and said, oh, I've heard that you've been in touch with Jack Moore and the governor has some concerns. And I said, yes, that's true. He said, well, hopefully we can get by those.
Any other discussions with Commissioner Desjardins or with the staff at the Department of Education on the subject matter we've talked about today that we have not discussed this morning?
The only other one, and to your, again, just prior question, was the governor and the governor's office. The only other conversation that I had with the governor on this topic was on the 10th, after it had been announced by the school that Mark Eves would be selected as president. The governor was traveling out of state and called me because he had heard something on the radio about education funding more broadly. When I called him back to give him the question, the answer to the question, so that he could understand what they were talking about on the radio, he mentioned that he wanted me to start working on charter school laws. He said, I want to make sure now that Speaker Eves is president of Good Will-Hinckley that we have the toughest charter school laws, the best charter school laws in the country. It was a comment I relayed to Acting Commissioner Desjardins. The Acting Commissioner got back to me and said because ours are so new, they are some of the best. And when I relayed that back to the governor, his reaction was no, Arizona's ranked #1, Maine's only ranked #3, and there's more that we can do, particularly if the speaker is now interested in charter schools. And that was my last interaction about Speaker of the House, meeting with Hinckley.
Thank you. Any other interactions with Greg Powell or anybody else in the Harold Alfond Foundation that you have not talked about this morning?
Not in that time frame and not about this matter. I've interacted with the Alfond Foundation on other matters.
Not on this one. Do you aware of any other interactions, communications between the governor or other members of the governor's staff and Harold Alfond Foundation that you have not discussed this morning?
I have no knowledge of anything that's personal.
You just told us about a casual conversation you had with the speaker in the parking lot. Any other communications you had with the speaker or any of his attorney regarding this matter?
I don't believe I've ever had any communication with his attorney, and that's the only time the Speaker of the House stopped me to speak to me about it.
I apologize, I may have asked you this before, but when did you first become aware of the Harold Alfond Foundation's concern about what was happening in terms of the potential loss?
At the same time.
Someday this may be a transcript, I hope not, but it's only just me finish my question.
I think under law it's required to be. So.
Actually not. It just has to be not recorded. We'll talk about that later. But in any event, how did you aware of, excuse me, let me rephrase that. When did you become aware that the Harold Alfond Foundation was expressing concern about the impact of potential state funding?
At the same time that the public did when it was reported in the Bangor Daily News.
At any time since the OPEGA began its review of this, which was, I believe, on July 1st, have you been involved in coordinating or discussing with the Commissioner or others at the Department of Education what documents would be provided to OPEGA?
The direction that I provided to the Commissioner as well as to the members of the Department of Education were that they should cooperate fully with OPEGA and that they should be truthful and provide exactly what they're asked for.
Okay, did you discuss with them any details about what information would be shared or not shared?
I think several times the Commissioner did reach out to let us know what he was sharing. I have at no time given any direction about what he should do. I've said that's his decision to make.
Other than that, are you aware of any other coordination or discussions occurring that did not involve you about what was going to be produced?
Again, I only think the coordination that we provided was to make sure that we understood which documents had already been provided and which ones he was providing and other ones. I think there may have been questions about whether there were any he considered to be privileged. I don't have any awareness of that conversation.
Thank you very much for your answers. I'm sure others will have questions. Chairman Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for coming today, Mr. Chadbourne. I appreciate it. One point that I just wanted to make sure you were aware of is that Good Will-Hinckley, the organization, has been around for 126 years. It's not a new entity. And the charter school is just one part of the organization which Mr. Eves was hired to lead. Just to clarify.
Thank you, and I do understand that. Okay. The new part I was referring to was the charter school. As we know, we haven't had charter schools that long in Maine, and the governor is quite invested in ensuring that they're successful.
Okay, my first question is, in your experience, is it common for the governor to insert himself into the internal affairs of an independent institution?
You've asked me that question before, Representative Kruger, when I saw you in Rockland, and I don't know that I would comment on what's common or what's not. I think there are a lot of institutions you could say are an external institution to the Maine State government. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, the governor and I had lunch at the Blaine House with several recently returned veterans who wanted to express their concerns about the VA hospital in Tokens. It's not an institution that we control, that we have any direct funding of, or that we really have any say about. But they were asking the governor to advocate on their behalf and to make inquiries about the director and the PR spokesperson for Tokens. And it's very common for him to respond when there are concerns that he does believe affect many people. And I think that the governor is interested in the management and oversight and operations of the school and making sure the school is successful. As I indicated, other schools, the university system, Chancellor Page is in regular touch when he's wanting to let the governor know about decisions he's made and presidents that have been selected to lead their schools. We regularly receive those comments. And not only that, I went back after our conversation in Rockland and looked to see whether there's precedent for this at all. And the precedent I did find was the episode I was previously unaware of in 2013 when Speaker of the House, Mark Eves, and then Senate President Justin Alfon were asking, I think this committee, I think they directed their letter to the Education Committee, but they were asking this committee to look into the management and the decisions being made for the leadership at the Baxter Academy when it became a charter school. I know some of you will remember that at the time, Mayor Brennan of Portland had instructed the superintendent of schools in Portland to withhold hundreds of thousands of dollars of mandatory taxpayer dollars that were intended to go to that school. And rather than ask questions about Mayor Brennan's decision at the time, the Speaker of the House and the Senate President asked questions about the management of the school, and they asked questions about the Charter Commission. So I certainly don't think that this is the first time that the governor had a concern about an organization that doesn't work as part of the executive branch of the state of Maine government, nor do I think it's the first time that, even as I've shown in presiding officers of the legislature, look into the management decisions being made at the charter school.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Any other questions, Mr. Chadbourne? Representative Stockdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for coming today, Mr. Chadbourne.
My pleasure.
I'm just trying to get back to the question of the fact that people remember things happening that you don't remember, and I'm referencing the report like you have. And it just said, right, I'm reading this, the Good Will-Hinckley board chair at the time, that was Mr. Moore, also recalled having 2 conversations with the governor's senior policy advisor, that is you.
Correct.
But did not provide any specific dates. He recounted that one of these times the senior policy advisor contacted him specifically to say that, and this is in quotes from him, we would have trouble supporting Good Will-Hinckley if you hire the speaker. Are you saying that that's true or not true?
First of all, I'm saying that it is true that I had those 2 conversations. I am characterizing the comments that I made, which was very, very clear and unequivocal that the governor did not believe the Speaker of the House was qualified. I didn't record the conversation. I don't have an exact transcript. I don't believe Mr. Moore was intending to provide you with a direct transcript of the conversation. However, I was very clear that the governor did not support the decision they had made, and that it was the board's decision, and that they had a difference of opinion when it came to his qualifications to lead the school.
So you're saying that you didn't say that you would have trouble supporting Good Will-Hinckley, or are you saying that you did say that?
I'm saying I don't know which words I used, Representative, and I'm trying to be as honest and transparent as I can. I don't know which words that I used.
Well,
I'm not saying that I didn't say it. I'm saying that the message I was intending to send, and which I believe was heard very loudly by Chairman Moore, was that the governor disagreed with their selection, and he did not have confidence that the board was making the decisions in the best interest of the school.
So, once again, I'm just going to ask you again because I really don't understand. I'm kind of a simple person. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a citizen legislator. To me, if somebody said that to me, I would think, well, what does that really mean? And Mr. Moore, who we had here in front of us, clearly took it to mean that financial support was what you were talking about.
I did not speak to what Mr. Moore thought.
Well, I guess I'm asking you, what did you intend? What did you intend to let him know? I mean, what was your point then? How is it your business?
Let me direct you to the governor's letter.
Why did you care?
What my business was to communicate.
Can I just say one other thing? How can we know? I mean, what are you there for? I mean, what did you have to say about it? Is it any of your business at all who Good Good Will-Hinckley hires unless you have something that you can hold over their head. What's your hammer? Your hammer is, oh, the governor's unhappy? That doesn't seem, in my world, that isn't, and I go, well, gee, my kids used to be unhappy when I would tell them they couldn't have something or do something, and go, well, gee, that's too bad. You know, really, what can you do about it? But so what was your hammer? What was the point of what you were doing other than to say, oh, he's unhappy, unless you thought it was going to go somewhere else? So that's what I'm asking, and I'm not, this isn't lawyer speak, I'm looking at it pretty simply, and Mr. Moore was in front of us, and he seemed to clearly think that there was a domino, and that it started with the conversations that he was hearing, and it just built from one to the other, and that he isn't the only one that had that characterization. There were others that did too. So I'm using the report, and I think that it's easy to say, well, I didn't say it quite like that, but really, what did you mean otherwise, and why was it your business?
First of all, my job in the governor's office when I work on education policy is to work to advance the governor's agenda to ensure that every child in the state of Maine is receiving a quality education, one that prepares them for a successful future, for careers, and the governor lacked confidence in the selection process and the selection that the board made. That was my unequivocal message. Communicating to Mr. Moore that the governor lacked confidence in the decision their board has made, I'm not surprised that he took that as a lack of the governor's support, because he lacked confidence in their decision-making about the management of the school. And Representative, I don't know, I don't engage in the type of tactics that you suggest where I believe in hammers. So rhetorical devices aside, my clear intent was to let the board of the school know that the governor disagreed, and my real intent of the phone call was to let them know that the governor had decided to send them a letter that contained the same information I was conveying right then. And so that was what I intended. That is what I said. I cannot speak to the exact words. I'm not sure that Chairman Moore was trying to tell you the exact words, but if he took from me saying that the governor lacked confidence in the decision the board had made and how they were managing the school, that the governor no longer supported them, I can understand why he would draw the conclusion.
Yes, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what was your intent, though? And so I say this to them, and then what did you expect them to do? You expected them to ignore you, what was the point? That if you didn't have anything that you could, or knew that was going to be held over them, what was the point of what you were, of the whole conversation?
Again, Representative, I don't engage in the type of thing where I hold something over someone. If that's something that you do, that's a decision for you to make. Now, I don't engage in that, and that is not the intention. If you read the governor's letter on June 8th that I was calling to let Chairman Moore know about, the governor says, I encourage you to continue your search process. It was not known at that time whether the speaker had signed a contract or whether the decision had been voted on by the board. It was not something that I knew. It's not something I believe the governor knew. And so we were intending to say, if the board has not made a final decision here, we don't think that's a qualified candidate. And we can encourage you to, the governor wanted to encourage the board to continue the selection process. That's the message that the governor intended to deliver in the letter. I didn't mean to convey anything other than that during my communication to Jack Moore.
Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the selection process, and I did want to ask you about that, because you said a few moments ago that the governor had no confidence in two things. One was the selection process, and the second was the result of that selection process. We've talked a lot about the assembly, but we now know there was a selection process that involved advertising and applications and rounds of interviews and the rest. When did you first become aware, if you did, before the report came out, about what that selection process was?
I believe I knew that they were conducting a search for a president. I think it had been a topic of conversation that there was a search while Richard was.
That's not my question. Obviously,
yes, I became aware. So I think the first time I heard anything of the search was in April when we met with the school. Second, I didn't learn anything else about that search until Commissioner Desjardins met with the governor on, I think, Friday, June 5th.
I'm not talking about whether there was a search or not. I'm talking about the selection process, about how it was that they came to the conclusion about hiring someone. Applications, interviews, vetting, second rounds of interviews, campus visits, all the rest of it. When did you first learn, before the report came out, about what the actual selection process had been?
I think Chairman Moore mentioned a couple of the details about it, but not any great depth during our phone conversation. When he was trying to explain why the committee had a different perspective than the governor on the selection market.
And what is your knowledge about what if anything, the governor learned about the actual selection process that Good Will-Hinckley had engaged in?
I don't know what all the governor has heard outside of what's been.
So when you say that there was a lack of confidence in the selection process as opposed to the result, what do you mean?
I think when the governor learned, number one, that when he went to write his letter to the chairman of the board and well as the chairman of the Maine school, he discovered that the chairman of the Maine school board was a staffer in Speaker Eaves' office. It didn't pass the straight face test for him.
What knowledge did the governor have of what involvement that person had or did not have in the selection process? Do you know?
Again, I believe it's what's contained in the report. I don't think he has any additional knowledge.
He learned it from the report.
I'm not sure where he's learned it, but I do know he's aware.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Other questions? Representative Misraki, excuse me, the Senator Johnson first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Going back to that same time frame, and the governor had already communicated in a letter during the search and selection process his feelings regarding Speaker Eaves. I understand. What was he hoping to accomplish through now having heard that there was a selection leaning towards, didn't know what regarding the hiring yet, that was later in the day, that was Speaker Eaves. What was your aim in having this additional conversation, this additional letter? Why would the governor feel that this decision that the Good Will-Hinckley board is authorized under statute and the charter and bylaw to make as a decision should be communicated about once again?
To my knowledge, Senator, this is the only letter that I was involved in, and it was what the governor asked. He wanted to make known to the board that disagreed with the decision, and that's the letter that he sent on the chain.
Thank you. Representative Duchesne.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for testifying. Good to see you. Precedents notwithstanding, Baxter, for instance, this is actually the first time funding was withheld for anything. We have a factual circumstance where funding was withheld. The governor has expressed that this was a bad decision, encouraged the search, but when that didn't happen, the funds were withheld. People in the Opega report felt that there was a threat conveyed by you or somebody. The threat actually was carried out. How do we reconcile these two?
In terms of the check that was not sent, I'd have to direct you to the acting commissioner. I had no involvement.
I thought that was probably what you would say, and I suspect you're right. Were you aware of the governor instructing anyone else to convey concerns about funding to Good Will-Hinckley?
I had no direct knowledge of that.
In the Channel 8 interview, the governor said about cutting off the funding, I did it, why wouldn't I? Now, you were not involved in that decision whatsoever.
Correct.
Right. And you weren't directed by anybody, or you didn't direct anybody to carry out the funding cutoff?
Correct.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Diamond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Good to see you.
Thank you for being here. I need to take you to a different date. I just need to tie some ends up here.
Okay.
On May 15th, the Board of Directors in Hinckley voted unanimously to hire Speaker Eaves. On May 22nd, Mr. Moore met with Mr. Desjardins, the acting commissioner, and discovered his discomfort. And according to the report, according to Mr. Desjardins' interpretation at least, offered the job to Mr. Desjardins after a week earlier having voted with the board unanimously to hire Mr. Eaves. Were you aware of that, and do you know why? Was that something the governor had asked Mr. Moore to do, or had he had any conversation with you or anyone else that you know of that would suggest to Mr. Moore that he offered the job to Mr. Desjardins?
The first knowledge I had of any of this was on Friday, June 5th. Friday, June 5th, when the commissioner spoke to the governor.
Okay, so anything happened prior to that?
I had no knowledge.
You had no knowledge at all? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Misraki.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to follow up on that conversation that where Mr. Moore really came out of that meeting with you thinking, finally, did he actually ask you, did Mr. Moore ask you if the funding for Good Will-Hinckley was in jeopardy?
No.
So he just kind of factored that out of thin air.
You have to ask him.
We did, and that he told us you told him.
I don't believe he's
I-
ever said that I made any comments about the funding for Good Will-Hinckley.
Your support, the funding was in jeopardy were the words that were used.
I don't believe he's ever said that I said that, and I certainly never said that for him.
So you're denying that he got that impression from?
I'm not denying anything about his impression. You'll have to ask him about his impression or what he thought based on what I said, but I am telling you,
I'm
I
just
never
telling you that
discussed
we
the
asked him, and in his mind, Good Will-Hinckley funding was in jeopardy, and that was conveyed to him by you.
Again, I'm not going to dispute whatever conclusions he may have drawn from our conversation, but it is not something I ever spoke to him about or said in words.
Thank you. Any further questions, Mr. Chadbourne? Yeah. Thank you very much for being here. I forgot to ask you, oh, I'm sorry, pardon me, Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Did you, in that same meeting, ever discuss the budget and the work going on in the budget?
In which meeting, sir?
The meeting with Mr. Moore.
I only had a brief conversation with him by phone, and no, we never discussed the budget.
Mr. Chadbourne, can you confirm that the records which you produced today are all the records you had in your possession and met the description of what we were looking for?
That is my impression. We had provided some documents at the earlier request of Director Ashcroft, and my search was intended to provide you any documents that were provided.
These copies that can be kept by the committee or the originals that need to be returned?
I draw copies of it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you.
The next person we have to be here is Cynthia Montgomery. Good morning, Counselor. Also represented by Mr. Cooper. Good morning. I'm on charge. Total, not you.
Correct. But I actually don't charge by the client. I charge by the 10th of the hour.
I'm sure you're enjoying your 20 hours here today.
Senator, you do our profession no good.
Bad joke.
We don't need more lawyer jokes.
Good morning, Ms. Montgomery. Thank you for being here. Do you have a statement you'd like to make?
I do. Senator Page, Representative Kruger, and members of the Government Oversight Committee. I'm Cynthia Montgomery, Chief Counsel for Governor LePage. Aaron and I did.
Excuse me, Ms. Montgomery. Pardon me. I forgot to swear you. Please swear you in. Swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Aaron and I didn't collaborate on our opening statement, so I didn't prepare to introduce myself to you, so you'll have to be talking to a complete stranger. In the interest of using our time most efficiently, I do want to begin by letting you know that my direct first-hand knowledge of the events that are the subject of your investigation is very limited. My first real involvement in these events did not begin until June 23rd, when Attorney David Gov't gave me a call on behalf of the Speaker. That's not to say that I was completely unaware of the Governor's objections to Speaker Eves being hired by Good Will-Hinckley, but I wasn't directly involved in those events. In sum, there are 3 events that are mentioned in the OPEGA report that I have firsthand knowledge of and can certainly speak to you about. The first is my communication with Attorney Gov't. Secondly, I was present at the cabinet meeting that Deputy Commissioner Desjardins mentioned. And third, I did reach out to Jack Moore at the end of July, or probably earlier than that, but tried to schedule an interview for the end of July in anticipation of the litigation that Attorney Gov't had suggested he would be filing. I never did conduct that interview with Mr. Moore because the veto questions arose. And of course, we prepared for that toward the end of July, early part of August. And in that interim, outside counsel was obtained for the governor, so I never did conduct that interview. With respect to these 3 events, I am certainly more than willing to answer any questions you may have. I also would like to address some of the speculation regarding my willingness to answer your questions. As you know, up until today, I have declined all invitations to answer questions about the governor's and the speaker's dispute. I do want to make it clear that I haven't refused to be here out of fear or a desire to hide anything, or as a result of any disrespect for this committee or the work that you have to do. I do recognize and understand that you have a job to do. I hope that you'll see that I do as well. When OPEGA released its report, I did find it to be both thorough and comprehensive in terms of what I actually knew. I believe then and believe now that the relevant facts have been found and fully identified. I'm here today because it did become clear last month with your vote to issue subpoenas that some of you thought I might have additional factual information that's critical to your inquiry. Based on my reading of the OPEGA report, I don't think that's the case, but to the extent I am able to contribute to the fact-finding, I'm prepared to do that. And with that, I'm ready to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Chairman Kruger?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Montgomery, for being here today. We appreciate it. When and how did you first learn that Speaker Eves had been hired or was in the process of being hired for the position as president of Good Will-Hinckley?
It's a difficult question for me to answer, and I'll tell you why. I remember kind of in a, you know how you can kind of know things are going on in the background? So I certainly knew about the governor's letter in the newspaper. I heard or overheard people talking about Good Will-Hinckley. As I said, I was present at the cabinet meeting, so I heard a comment there. In terms of actually knowing specifically that Good Will-Hinckley had hired the speaker, and that the governor may or may not have said something about funding, that kind of thing, I really learned about that from Attorney Weber, the details.
And that was in later on in June?
It was third week of June. I think the report says June 23rd, and that seems about right.
Did you have any knowledge prior to this time that the speaker had applied for or was being considered for the position?
No, I mean, not until I heard that he had been hired. I didn't know anything about that prior to that.
Did you have a specific reaction when you did hear the news?
Personally?
Yeah.
No.
To your knowledge, when and how did the governor first learn about Speaker Eves hiring for this job, or if he was in the process of being hired?
Well, I have no direct knowledge. I mean, I've heard Mr. Chadbourne's testimony today. I've read the OPEGA report, but I personally, directly did not. I don't know.
Could you tell us what you know of what the governor's reaction was when he did hear the news? Any particular action or people that he contacted?
The only thing I can tell you about, I assume, is the cabinet meeting. I know he made an offhand comment at the cabinet meeting about Speaker Eves being hired. So, that's the best I can.
But you didn't hear or witness any reaction from the governor?
Upon him first learning? No.
Did anything else occur between the 5th of June and the 8th of June that was in regard to these matters and the governor or the education staff?
Nothing I had direct knowledge of.
And he didn't ask you to get involved in any way at that point?
To the extent you're asking about any communication between me and the governor specifically, communications between me and the governor would be protected by attorney-client privilege. And that privilege belongs to the client, not the attorney. So to the extent you want to delve into those conversations, I'm afraid that I just can't answer your questions.
Can I ask you, are you saying that there were conversations, Ms. Montgomery, you're just not prepared to talk about them because of a claim of attorney-client privilege?
Senator Cates, if I may, I believe what the witness is telling you is that she is the standing counsel to the governor. She has routine conversations with the governor that are attorney-client privilege conversations. If you're asking, has she had any privileged conversations of any kind with the governor, the answer to that question is clearly yes. If you're asking her to confirm whether her privileged conversations with the governor include particular topics, that too is a privileged matter.
But let's talk about that for a minute, because I respectfully disagree. The attorney-client privilege when it comes to public attorneys is extremely limited. So if I might ask this question, Ms. Montgomery, did you have discussions with the governor with respect to the Good Will-Hinckley hiring decision, other than the ones you told us about? I don't, with all due respect, even that is not protected by the attorney-client privilege, even for private attorneys, whether the subject was discussed. Would you appear to answer that question?
Like to do is, I do want to stand on a testimony that initially, when all this was kicking off, June 5th and 8th, and I think that was initially the question between June 5th and 8th, I really was not involved and don't have direct knowledge of anything that happened up until really June 23rd.
Okay, so I apologize for interrupting, Mr. Chairman, but so your testimony here is that you did not have any discussions with the governor about the subject of the Good Will-Hinckley hiring decision, at least until June 23rd. Is that your testimony?
My testimony is I don't have any direct knowledge about any of those events before June 23rd.
So the answer to my question is no, you did not have any discussions with the governor before June 23rd on the subject of the Good Will-Hinckley hiring decision?
To the extent that you're asking me to confirm a subject matter that I may have had a discussion with my client about, I'm refusing to answer.
Perhaps at this point we might hear from. Well, let me ask Attorney Rupert this question, because the rule, as you know better than I, with respect to government lawyers, is very limited. Let me read you that rule and ask you to tell us how this plays out here this morning. But the Rule 502, which talks about attorney-client privilege, says the lawyer-client privilege does not apply to communications between a public officer and his lawyers. And only if there's a finding that disclosure of that conversation would seriously impair the public officer's ability to process a claim or carry out a pending investigation, litigation, or proceeding in the public interest. The lawyer-client privilege will only apply to those communications. So how is the answering the question about whether she talked to the governor about the Good Will-Hinckley matter covered by that rule?
Senator Cates, respectfully, there are two issues. One is the question of an evidentiary privilege and the privilege rules in the rules of evidence. And the other is the ethical duties that you and I and Ms. Montgomery and all licensed lawyers owe to our clients to maintain confidences and secrets, which is broader than the attorney-client privilege, and that is a duty that is binding on us. I think that Ms. Montgomery has tried to tell you the nature of her involvement in these affairs, which is very limited. But now I think you're pressing her to answer a question that neither you nor I nor any licensed lawyer would be comfortable answering, which is a question from a person saying, I know that you are this person's lawyer, and I know that you have privileged conversations with them about conversations to give them legal advice. And now I'm asking you, do your conversations include this particular topic? And that strikes me as not fair game, and one that any lawyer would be very comfortable answering just voluntarily without checking with their client. That doesn't strike me as it should be particularly puzzling to any lawyer. As far as the evidentiary rule and the scope of the attorney-client privilege for public officials, as you know, the matter that is,
Sorry, go ahead.
the matter that is under consideration here, as you know, and as Ms. Montgomery has told you, her involvement started with a call about private litigation between Speaker Eves, apparently in his personal capacity as a private citizen, against the governor individually, and he sought out counsel. And I mean, we know he sought out counsel on that matter, and that is how her involvement started. So we get into an area that's very uncomfortable, and that really, I'm not sure it bears on the committee's investigation. Ms. Montgomery has had no involvement in the matters that are really laid out in the subpoena. That is, discussions about funding, policy-making discussions about funding, discussions with Good Will-Hinckley about the hiring, discussions with Good Will-Hinckley or means or anything about the selection of Speaker Eves, and she's told you that already. And it feels like we're simply pressing a lawyer as far as we can to the point that would make any lawyer really uncomfortable, and I'm not clear to what purpose.
Well, are you suggesting, sir, that her testifying that she never discussed something with the governor would somehow violate attorney-client privilege?
I think that when you have someone who is your standing counsel, who anybody can expect you routinely consult with on legal matters, I think the question, do your consultations with your client include this topic? That's really no different than asking a lawyer, did your discussions with your client cover this aspect or that aspect of a legal issue?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I've got some questions that I think we're a little bit stalled on, and I suspect maybe other members of the committee do too, and I'm going to request that the committee go into executive session with counsel to discuss this. Is that real?
Discuss this with Deputy Attorney Pissner?
Yes, with Chief Deputy Attorney General Linda Pissner and our staff.
Discussion with respect to the motion. Okay.
Formally, I don't know if you want to refer to the motion that references
Right,
the piece of
right.
statute.
I'm sorry, yes, I have that. I'm sorry, I thought I had the motion right here. I move that the committee go into executive session to discuss information obtained in executive session made confidential by Title III, Section 427. Did I get that wrong?
Thanks for lack of a second.
Restating my motion, I move that the committee enter executive session to take testimony of witness? No, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies to everyone, and I'm stumbling here. I wasn't ready to make this. In accordance with Title I, Section 405-6E, I move that the Government Oversight Committee go into executive session to consult with our attorney concerning our legal rights and duties in connection with the situation we're in right now with a witness refusal to answer on attorney-client privilege.
Discussion with respect to the motion? Seeing none, all in favor?
No,
Oh, I'm sorry, pardon me, Senator Diamond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm uncomfortable going into executive session on this issue. I just want to say that. And I guess could we be a little more specific as to what we're going to be dealing with Ms. Kitzner on this question. I'm sure a lot of folks would like to have us go into executive session for a lot of reasons, and so I really am very uncomfortable with that. So we would be a little more specific.
I think the purpose of the executive session would be to get advice from our attorney about whether or not we should press forward with inquiring about conversations Ms. Montgomery may have had with the governor on the subject.
And that would be the only question.
That would be it. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And clarify so that the question whether to press forward be a matter of our understanding what our legal rights and powers are versus those that have been communicated, where the line is drawn on what we may proceed with within the law.
That's right.
Thank you.
Further discussion? And all in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. We're going to briefly be in executive session. And rather than asking all of you to leave, I think what we're going to do is try to go to this little conference room off the hearing room to talk about it. So we won't be very long.
Yes, we do. We need to get something out of that. You know that I had a long discussion with Lee Johnson.
Guess who turns 20 tomorrow? Yeah. What has happened? It doesn't seem like it's possible, does it? Park her buggy right outside your office. Oh, how are you? Remember that way back there? She's fine. Oh, she's got this one. Oh, that's pretty. Oh, looks like she can't do like background. Right. Aaron Chadbourne, realtor. You don't look Dale. Oh, you're very nervous. Well, it just goes down. You know that song? My mom goes
21 year old. I was going to say 24. As your children are, who I know your daughter has a dental practice. We should switch. It does really good. Thank you. What do you guys do?
So make sure it was flattering.
Yeah, sit here.
You need a bottle of water or anything, or you're all set?
Well, my daughter's in New York. Fashion school. New York, but my son's still at home. No. Took a few years off. He's back, but he's got a few years. Quickly.
Certainly. That's what I said yesterday. He can come back away. He's like, he should change. You know, like me, and I wasn't going to make you. I wasn't going to make you struggle.
You're still real estate. It's going well.
That's exciting. She's just started as a startup, so
Is she getting her own?
with a group your own. So for you, it's not like you. It's not. Yeah, she makes some shit. She's right away. Well, yeah, if you were on a job, I could there we go. Nice to see you. Make sure you say hi to Hubby. I will. Just and just say, she didn't think it was me because so I want to know what soap you're This room's a lot cooler than the other one. It's going to warm up before the day's out. Yeah, it's like all the time. So much. The same old guy. It's like, hey. That's why it's like I'm gonna wear short sleeve under all my clothes. I know
I won't see it now. And when she comes in, thank you. They go by me. No, well, I knew, but I knew
Yeah, but not like loves his work.
Yeah, I got a notice now, running out of storage.
They got married on September the 28th. No, yes, just got married. And here's the place. Her grandmother's still
I heard that. Rob.
Yeah. Yeah, I go to New York. I mean, Sherry, she's a dancer, does commercials and stuff. And I teach 3 kinds of exercise. I heard that. She's doing our ad. Is the Brio, which was in the 90s. But anyway, so I go down, I go to work out, I go to New York, and I go to places around the country, regional theaters, and yeah, I love it. Very often, go off for a month or Yes. And anyway, he and Lila and I all met at the same time. We wanted to show together and had been very close with
You're the only one that didn't.
Yeah, I come right here. He starts at 12. I just stays a half an hour, and I just sit there. Marshall's and whatever.
So what did you come over? Let's go. My sister makes things. I'm not going
Yep, I can do that. But how is it? Good, good.
I was going to say, I knew it was familiar. You can go,
But I am going to Scott. I'll be down there.
No, I don't.
Yeah, that you had a great district. Yeah, but at the same time, I use that as an example. Bring it in that that's one thing. And eventually there's a way to work it out. Do you ask the lady at right next to you? She's one of those. Right. But it's about safety. I know it. When you talk
Find your way over here.
No, dear, you're just fine. I'm in my own way. I get tucked far enough back. Want to use it? Like if we get the phone going off, why do you do that?
That was embarrassing.
One time I was in court.
Yeah.
And the phone went off, and I'm like, which phone is that? Like next to my jacket. It was mine. And the judge is like, Senator, stand. Stand, don't sit down. Stand.
I know that. We convened the meeting of the Government Oversight Committee, and we apologize to everybody for having gone into executive session. I just want to make sure everybody understands why. This question about attorney-client privilege, we needed to hear from our own counsel, legal advice about what the parameters of that rule are. And it's appropriate for us to have done that in executive session. That's the only thing we talked about. And I can't tell you what the discussion was, and no one here will, because that's the whole deal with executive sessions. There's nothing nefarious. So we're ready to go ahead. And just so that I've spoken with Consul Ruprecht about this, about where we're coming down on this issue. And there may be specific objections to questions going forward, but the attorney-client privilege when it relates to public officials is extremely narrow. It's governed by a specific rule of evidence. And just to read the beginning of it again, the lawyer-client privilege does not apply to communications between a public officer or agency and its lawyers. However, if the court, or in this case the committee, determines that disclosure will seriously impair the public officer's or agency's ability to process a claim or carry out a pending investigation, litigation, or proceeding in the public interest, the lawyer-client privilege will apply to communications concerning the pending investigation, claim, or action. A lot of fancy language, but at least it's clear to me as the chair it doesn't apply here. So what we're going to ask is that Ms. Montgomery answer questions about her conversations with the governor on the subject of this matter, except to the extent that if the governor is asking her for advice, that statement by the governor asking for advice, or anything Ms. Montgomery may have told him in terms of giving advice, would be privileged. Nothing else would. So I hope that's relatively clear moving ahead. And this is a pretty new area for Maine law to even dealing with. So thank you for your indulgence and let us talk it through. So why don't we go ahead? And Ms. Montgomery, let me ask you this question. At any time, did you have discussions with the governor about the decision by Good Will-Hinckley to hire the speaker, or what the implications might be for funding of the school by that decision?
While you were in executive session, I did have the opportunity to consult with my client, and I'm authorized...
Your attorney. Oh, your client, excuse me.
My client, yes, and my attorney, as a matter of fact. But I'm authorized to answer your question. No, I did not have those discussions.
At any time?
Correct.
Before or after June 23rd, which I think was the date we were using in the earlier
June 23rd was the date that I really got involved in the whole situation. So if you're, maybe I need a little clarification, because I do want to be clear that I'm authorized to answer the question that no, we did not have those discussions. I think the original question was about between June 5th and June 8th, but I might be wrong.
Well, let me ask you this. What was the date you were contacted by Attorney Gov't, who was the speaker's attorney?
I believe it was June 23rd.
Okay, so before you were contacted by the attorney for the speaker and became aware that the litigation was a possibility, you had no conversations with the governor on the subject matter of the Good Will-Hinckley funding issue or the speaker's hiring. Is that your testimony?
That's correct.
Thank you very much.
We may have already gone through this, but could you remind me, were you present at the cabinet meeting on June 9th?
Yes, I was.
Do you have any memory of the governor reacting to the news at that cabinet meeting of Markey's hiring?
I remember the governor making one comment, perhaps. It was an offhand, can you believe they hired somebody who's not qualified, or I can't believe they hired Mark Eves, or it was something like that. It was one comment. I've given you two, but that was the nature of the comment, and I wouldn't characterize it as even venting. I mean, it was a comment.
So as you recall it, there wasn't a discussion by the cabinet or at the cabinet meeting of this particular item.
That's correct.
There were other things, obviously. On the very last sentence on page 14 of the OPEGA brief, it mentions Mr. Moore telling OPEGA that Mr. Chadbourne contacted him at some point to inform Mr. Moore that a lawyer would like to speak with him. You've provided emails to the committee, which we appreciate, that show that you contacted Mr. Moore on July 20th, expecting that Mr. Chadbourne had already mentioned this to him.
Yes.
It also shows that you arranged a meeting with Mr. Moore through Good Will-Hinckley attorneys for Thursday, July 23rd, though you ended up needing to reschedule that meeting. The emails do not indicate anything about when that meeting was rescheduled for. Can you tell us your purpose in contacting and wanting to meet with Mr. Moore, and did you meet with him, and what was discussed?
The purpose, really the reason I reached out to him was by that time it was clear that litigation was in fact going to be filed. I can't remember when the lawsuit was actually filed, but it was around, that's what I wanted to talk to Mr. Moore about, was in anticipation of litigation, because I'd received a phone call from Attorney Weber prior to that. We never did end up actually rescheduling the meeting, and I did not interview him, as I mentioned, because the veto issues arose, and that was a pretty intense 3-week period there, when I was otherwise occupied.
Okay. Other than interactions and communications that have already been discussed here, please describe any additional interactions or communications that you have had with anyone at Good Will-Hinckley means or with their attorneys at any time regarding the hiring of the speaker?
There are none.
Does that include funding issues?
That's correct.
So the decision or the threat or whatever of withdrawing funds, you were not consulted on that matter?
I think you asked me if I had any conversations with anyone at Good Will-Hinckley, and I did not.
Could you describe any interactions and communications that you were involved in with the governor or others in the governor's office on this subject matter that we might not have mentioned so far?
I believe the answer to your question is there aren't any, so I'd like to hear your question again just to make sure.
Well, it's actually, I'm trying to get to what else we can flesh out in terms of the communications in the governor's office about the decision to withhold funding. That's where I want to go.
Okay.
And if you're his attorney, I would have assumed that the governor would have talked to his attorney about the decision to withhold funds. And I just want to know if you've had any conversation on that regard.
I did not have any conversations with the governor about the funding or withholding funding. I had no conversations.
Does that apply to Good Will-Hinckley as well?
Yeah. Yes, you mean people employed by Good Will-Hinckley? That's correct. I didn't have
So
any
you were
conversations with anyone who's with Good Will-Hinckley except Mr. Moore, and it was just that time period trying to schedule the interview, and then we didn't have it.
Did you discuss or have any interactions or communications with Commissioner Desjardins about this subject material in this time frame, May, June, July?
I believe after the decision had been made about the funding, I think that's when I heard, with holding the check. I believe that's when I heard about it, and I did hear about it from the Deputy Commissioner.
Could you describe any communications or interactions you might have had with Greg Powell or other representatives of the Harold Alfond Foundation about funding?
None.
You've had none?
None.
Are you aware of any other interactions and communications between the governor or other governor's staff with Mr. Powell or other representatives of the foundation that have not been covered in the OPEGA brief?
No.
Have you had any interactions or communications with the speaker or his staff regarding this? And if so, when did they occur and what was discussed?
No.
The OPEGA brief does describe some exchanges between you and the speaker's attorney on June 22nd and 23rd that you've mentioned. Are you aware of any other interactions or communications between the governor or other people in the governor's office and the speaker or the speaker's attorney that have not been captured in the OPEGA report?
No.
At any time since OPEGA began this review on July 1st, have you been involved in coordinating or discussing with the commissioner or others at DOE what documents would be provided to OPEGA?
By discussing with them, I guess I want to be clear. I didn't direct any production of documents or that kind of thing. I did ask that a copy of the documents provided to OPEGA be also given to me.
At any time since OPEGA began the review on July 1st, have you been involved in coordinated discussing with Mr. Moore or others at Good Will-Hinckley what documents should be provided to OPEGA?
No.
Are you aware of any conversations or communications regarding documentation?
With people from Good Will-Hinckley?
Yes, with Good Will-Hinckley.
No.
And would that also be true with the Harold Alfond Foundation?
That's correct.
So you were, okay, that's fine, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Representative DeShane.
Thank you. This is just a quickie. When the senior policy advisor informed the board president that you wanted to speak with the board, that was really just to get your own arms around the situation. It was not under questions from anybody else.
That's
You were just prepping yourself. Thank you.
Yes.
Further questions? Senator Johnson.
Mr. Chair, Ms. Montgomery, did you described earlier having no direct knowledge of the matters prior to the 23rd. Can you tell us who provided in the course of the cabinet meeting on the 9th or other occasions before the 23rd, any indirect knowledge? Who, if we want answers, should we be consulting?
I'm not sure.
You were asked about your knowledge of the funding discussions, about responses, reactions to Speaker E's hiring, and basically stated you had no direct knowledge. Can you tell us what indirect knowledge, who was the source of the indirect knowledge that came your way regarding these topics?
I'm not sure I totally understand your question, but certainly Mr. Chadbourne had information and Deputy Commissioner Desjardins had information. I assume that's what you're asking?
And that's all you can recall for any knowledge that you obtained indirectly regarding the Good Will-Hinckley hiring and regarding funding?
I can't think of anyone else. You know, certainly people were talking about it. I read some of the newspaper reports, you know, that kind of thing. There's definitely no one who hasn't been identified by OPEGA or interviewed by them.
So, if I might ask a quick question. The cabinet meeting on the 9th, you said there was no discussion of Eve's hiring other than the offhand comment that you
That's my recollection,
indicated
yes.
happened. Was there anything else relevant to the Means School that was a topic of discussion in that meeting?
Nothing that I remember.
Senator Dunn, sorry, then Representative Strachey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just need to fill in some blanks here. Thank you for being here. When were you hired to be the governor's legal counsel?
Well, I've done 2 stints. Last year, for 3 months, I filled in while Carly McLean, the governor's chief counsel, was out on leave.
Can you just, excuse me, those 3 months were when? When that meeting?
I believe they were February, March, and April. March, April, May.
All 14?
Sorry, 14, yes. And then this year, I was hired at the beginning of February, along with Mr. Chadbourne.
And that's his full-time legal counsel?
Yes.
Does he have any other legal counsel other than you?
There's a deputy legal counsel, Hank Fenton, but other than that, we're at. I should correct a little bit. I did, at the beginning of February, I actually agreed to fill in until the governor's office might find legal counsel. And then eventually the governor asked me to stay. And so that's when I really became full-time permanent.
And how would you describe your job responsibility with the governor?
How would I describe it? The scope of it is enormous. It's very challenging, and
basically covering any and all topics regarding legal issues.
Any and all topics. It's the scope is huge.
Thank you.
Representative Strachey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Montgomery, thanks for being here. I just have, and I apologize if you already answered this, but I just can't recall it in going through the notes that I have. On June 22nd, on June 23rd, that's when the Speaker's attorney told LePage that the governor's chief counsel contacted him by telephone and informed him that she had conferred with the governor and he would not withdraw his threat. Now, that's in the report. Is that a good characterization of what happened from your perspective?
Attorney Weber and I had 2 phone calls. He called me first to let me know he thought he had a claim for constitutional retaliation, that he had some case law for me to look at, and wanted to know if the governor would change his position with respect to the speaker. I told him I would get back with him. So maybe on the 23rd is when I got back with him. Maybe we talked on the 22nd and I got back on the 23rd, or talked on the 23rd and I got back on the 24th, whatever. I got back with him, and I didn't say the governor won't withdraw his threat. I said the governor's not inclined to change his mind about the speaker. I do recall saying that specifically.
So you specifically spoke to the governor then about the issue and asked him about it, or were you just giving that opinion based on yourself without talking to him at all?
I do want to be careful. The reason I'm pausing is, again, I want to protect communications between the governor and I that are potentially privileged. But I agreed when I spoke to Mr. Weber the first time to talk to the governor, and then I would call Mr. Weber back after having done that, and that's what I did.
Mr. Chair, I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but I would like to know that conversation.
I think that in fairness to the witness, the rules we discussed were that in conversations which she may have had with the governor after it became a real possibility that there might be litigation, would be protected by attorney-client privilege.
So I'm not asking you what advice you gave him, I'm just asking, so she did discuss with the governor the threat of the funding being withheld. Is that a legal question to ask? Is that okay?
I think discussions that she had with the
I'm sorry. I'm not aware. I apologize.
my law professors would be appalled that I'm in a position where to be asked to rule on anything. But I think that the distinction is that once the speaker's attorney called her and said there may be litigation, and any conversations after that are off limits.
and it isn't about that, so I will abide by his ruling and not ask another one. But you did say something about speaking with Acting Commissioner Desjardins.
Yes.
About the funding issue, or did you ever have a discussion with Commissioner Desjardins about whether the funding was was in jeopardy for Good Will-Hinckley, or anything around that area of issue?
I didn't have a conversation like the one you described, but after Commissioner Desjardins had made the decision about holding the check, it was sometime after that he told me about having done that. More than likely, I really learned about that for the first time in the press and then heard from him, but I don't have a specific memory about that time. So he did talk to me about that, though. Tell me.
But you don't remember what the conversation, what it was about? Why would he bring it up to you? I mean, I'm just curious.
I do remember.
Would you have a problem telling us what that conversation was?
No, I don't have a problem. He told me that he was in a staff meeting of some sort, and there was a point in the staff meeting where there was a question about whether to hold a check that was going to Good Will-Hinckley. I remember him saying, I paused for quite a while, and he told me his thought process was, it's easier to hold it than it would be to get it back, and that he then decided it should be held.
And the date of that, do you have general?
That's the problem.
In relation to the cabinet meeting, in relation to?
I don't even know what day the staff meeting was, but I'm sure that's in the OPEGA report, and it was definitely after that had occurred.
Thank you, Representative. Other questions for Attorney Montgomery? Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Montgomery, I believe in your opening statements you said something about having no knowledge prior to June 23rd regarding these matters I'm discussing. And moments ago, you said that you spoke with Attorney Weber on the 21st.
No, I didn't. I certainly didn't mean to say that. If I did, I misspoke.
Perhaps you could clarify for us.
There's a date in the OPEGA report, I believe it's June 23rd, that OPEGA has found that we spoke. And I think that there actually are emails that would say for sure whether it was June 23rd or June 22nd. Attorney Weber and I had 2 conversations, and I believe they were on 2 different days, back to back.
And what I think you said moments ago was that he contacted you on the 21st in inquiry regarding whether the governor would consider rescinding his position on.
I think either it was the 22nd and 23rd or 23rd and 24th is what I believe. I don't believe it was June 21st.
Thank you. Just one other question, if I could. Sure. It has to do with whether you were involved in coordinating or discussing with anyone what documents would be provided to OPEGA as part of the review. And I think you said none, but wasn't there an email from the Commissioner of Education asking you for some guidance on what should be provided and not provided?
There was an email, him asking me, and I didn't really advise. I let him know that in my opinion, as you know, I raised some question about OPEGA's jurisdiction with respect to examining the governor's exercise of executive authority. I let the commissioner know that I didn't think those same arguments applied to agencies, and therefore he, would need to respond to OPEGA, and I wasn't advising one way or the other. To be fair, I know that I did say to him and probably Susan Bodwin, and I want to say Deb Plowman, if you're asked to testify, tell the truth. I remember saying that specifically.
Thank you. And as I will with every witness, this is going to inquire into documents. You've produced all the documents that you are aware of in response to the subpoena request?
Yes. And
they're copies, so we don't need to give them back. Is that
correct?
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Counsel, for being here. Thank you. The next person we have asked to testify would be Tom Desjardins. I'm not sure what your title is these days, so I didn't say.
currently deputy commissioner, for the context of the report and everything, anything will suffice.
Sir, could you raise your right hand? Do you promise or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Thank you. And just so that everybody's clear, Deputy Commissioner Desjardins had wanted to be here for our last meeting because of medical issues, and we could do so. He was quite adamant about the fact that he wanted to be here. So thank you for being here today, and we'd be pleased to hear from you with respect to any statement you might want to make.
I don't, other than to say that part of my adventure over the last couple of months involves some damage to my lung, and on occasion I start coughing loudly and what seems like dangerously, but it's just my cough trying to fix along. It's not contagious, it's not the flu. So if I burst into coughing, it has nothing to do with anything that is serious or warranted or could be passed on to folks. It's just a bruise, basically.
Thank you.
My voice crackles a little bit because of
Thanks. I've got a number of questions I'd like to ask first, if I could, sir. First of all, you had a lunch meeting with Jack Moore, who is the board chair of Good Will-Hinckley, on May 22nd, I believe was the date. And Mr. Moore talked with you about what was going on at Good Will-Hinckley with their hiring process. And what did you understand the status with respect to Good Will-Hinckley hiring a speaker when you left that luncheon meeting?
He told me on that day that the search committee had reported out results, for lack of a better description, that they had arrived at 2 candidates, 2 finalists, if you will. There was a third person that he was interested in that had not applied, was not considered, but wanted to ask me what I felt about that person. So at the time he said the committee has arrived at Speaker Eves and a woman from Massachusetts as the 2, I think he referred to them as finalists for the position. And again, he expressed an interest in this other person who might also be a strong candidate but had not applied, and that was part of the discussion.
Apparently, you left that meeting with the understanding that Mr. Moore was asking you if you might be interested in that job, and he had a little different recollection. Could you tell us what you recall about that?
There were 3 times during the conversation, and I remember them at awkward times and not in the context of back and forth discussion, when he said, and I can quote exactly, you know, you'd be great for this position. And the first time I said thank you and moved on in the discussion. The second time I didn't think much. But after the third time, I started to realize that there might be something more than just being complimentary. So I said to him, I appreciate it. I thank you for your confidence. I'm just getting started in the department. Things are going well in education. I'm not interested in leaving state government, but thank you. And so that was pretty much the extent of the conversation.
Did you recall, excuse me, did you tell the governor or anyone in the governor's office about your meeting with Mr. Moore and the fact that the speaker was at least being considered for the presidency there?
The next time I met with the governor was roughly, how many days it was, on the 5th of June. And as contrary to, as a policy advisor, to meet with the governor almost daily. That was my old habit as commissioner. I'm in the next building and don't catch up with him like I used to. So the next time I met with him was about the logging program. So that was my first opportunity in the normal schedule of things to sit down and say, and raise that issue, because we had been working for a long time to try to get Hinckley involved in a program, and the arrival of a new president would impact that in some way, so I mentioned it at that meeting.
And there was a briefing memo apparently written, I take it that you wrote that, sir?
Yes.
And the memo apparently says that the selection process at that point was complete, that they had selected a candidate, and that candidate was going to begin on July 1. Is that fair?
Mm-hmm.
And did you mention in the briefing memo who the successful applicant was?
No, I don't think I did, because in the day or two before, I don't remember this half of the conversation, but I spoke with Rich Abramson, who at the time was on his way out as the interim president and so on, at Hinckley, and I said, we talked about the logging program. And I don't remember this part of the conversation, but he does, and I certainly defer to his memory of it. We discussed briefly that they had chosen a new president who would start July 1st and so on. So I think I put that in the memo because that was part of my discussion with him.
Well, it just strikes me as somewhat odd that, knowing that they had selected the speaker, you didn't include his name in the memo. Was there a reason for that?
No, and I'm not sure. I don't remember that part of the conversation I had on the phone with Mr. Abramson that referred to this part. Again, I was focused on the logging program. I made 2 or 3 other calls in the same half hour about it, and to other places. And so I'm not sure. He might have told me that it was the speaker. I knew the speaker was one of the 2 finalists, but I'm not sure I was thinking in terms of making any big announcement to the governor, just that there was a change in leadership there, which would, another change in leadership, since President Cummings had left, and that may impact whether or not the school was ready to get underway with the program and that sort of thing.
Well, in the June 5th meeting with the governor, did you tell the governor that it was
I did.
the speaker who had been picked for that?
Yeah.
And what was the governor's reaction?
It was, he was surprised, a little shocked. I've certainly seen him give much stronger reactions to other issues. But I think a lot of it was, and we discussed in the cabinet, his comment in the cabinet meeting had to do with the same sort of, can you believe this sort of point of view or expression? And he, said, but he's supposed, he went down a list of things that, in his opinion, did not make him an excellent candidate, and was startled or surprised that the school that he had invested so much time and effort into in the previous 3 years to keep it going had made a decision he disagreed with it. So.
My next question is, do you recall if I put you under oath or not?
Yes, you did.
I thought so.
You can do it again if it makes you feel
No, that's good. I think it might make sense. What are the other people here?
Even the president was sworn in twice because you weren't sure they did it right.
Okay.
That was the question. People in the audience.
You indicated the governor verbalized a list of concerns he had.
Yes.
What were those, if you recall?
Interestingly enough, when the report came out, I went back and looked at those and found that the concerns that I raised with Jack Moore at the lunch were almost identical to the concerns that he and the board had raised with the speaker 2 weeks before. And then I looked forward in the report to the governor's letter where he expressed his concerns, and they were almost the same identical concerns, and in fact, almost in the same order that they had been expressed, first by the board at Hinckley, then by me, and then by the governor. And from my perspective, largely it was that a sitting speaker of the House is a really busy person. And as sitting speaker...
Yep. So this is things the governor told you? I'm not asking for
probably, yeah, probably. I mean, they generally the same, I guess what I'm getting at is generally the same concerns raised, but just the same ones raised over and over by many people. And so, but his were, he's opposed charter schools fairly vehemently over the years. Of course, the governor has been a big proponent of them, so he remembered that. How much time does the speaker have? He lives 2 hours or an hour and a half away from the school. If he's going to stay a speaker, he can't move from his district. Things that, has he ever run a school? Does he have background in education? Those kinds of issues.
Okay, was your understanding at that meeting that the hiring decision had been made?
When I met with the governor?
Yes.
Yeah, I think Rich had said to me he begins on July 1st.
All right. Now, you told Opega, sir, that at some point you had a conversation with the governor in which he told you, don't send Good Will-Hinckley any money not required by law. You said you couldn't recall when that conversation took place, when you talked to Opega a couple months ago, I guess. Do you have any further recollection about when that may have taken place?
A little, and Aaron Chadbourne, I believe it was just after the cabinet meeting, because of the nature of the meeting. I was standing up, not sitting down. It was kind of an impromptu. And after cabinet, especially if it ends early, we often will, hey, can I have 5 minutes? And we were talking about something. So it's most likely that it happened right after cabinet.
Right. And what do you recall about the cabinet meeting and this subject being discussed at that meeting?
Again, it's the same as others who testified. The governor, his comments were of a "can you believe this" nature. Can you believe? I don't know if he said, "Can you believe someone they hired at charter schools hired someone who's opposed to charter schools," or which line of frustration he was expressing. But he just said, it wasn't inquiring of the cabinet. He was just pointing out something that I think it was in the newspaper article confirming it had been published that morning, which probably made either midnight or 6 o'clock. So the official news in the media that the speaker had been hired was fresh. And so he, as part of cabinet, he often discusses what's going on in state government and said, something to the effect of, can you believe they've hired this person to be the speaker?
You told the governor on June 5th he was hired. The cabinet meeting's on June 9th, I believe. And I'd like to ask you now about conversations you had with Mr. Moore, the board chair of Good Will-Hinckley, during that period between the 5th and the 9th. First of all, and I understand you reached out to him. What was your purpose of communicating?
The first phone call I made after, the official word sort of came out was to clarify a number of names on the board. We had heard that both boards had voted unanimously to hire the speaker. And so someone in the governor's office looked at the names on the list and found a few that seemed, if they were the person we were thinking of, would raise a question. And so they said, can you call Jack and find out if, for example, that Bill Brown is the Bill Brown we think it is, a common name. And so I, said to him, I think at that point I said to him, the governor's, obviously not happy with your choice. And I kind of asked him a couple, is this the, the person that's this person, is this the Joe Jones, who's that? And that was most of the conversation. And he said, I'm understanding, I'm frustrated that the governor's upset, and that sort of conversation. It was mostly to find out to confirm that people who, according to press reports, had voted to hire the speaker were in fact the people we anticipated.
Was that the only conversation you had with him during that period of time, if you remember?
Probably only phone conversation. We had a couple of emails back and forth that are part of the record for the report, and I think he expressed a desire to meet with the governor, and I passed that along. And he had mentioned once, the board's going to meet and discuss it further tomorrow, and so I said I'm really anxious to hear how that goes. We relatively short conversations up until one past that, well past that time period.
In your conversation with Mr. Moore, did you tell him or suggest to him that the funding for Good Will-Hinckley might be cut if the speaker were hired?
I don't believe so, but I want to point out something in my mindset, particularly with lobbyists and others. Prior to any of this occurring, prior to probably the speaker being, well, probably after the speaker was interviewed, but before I had any knowledge of it, the legislature had cut $5.5 million from two areas in the budget that the department has discretion over. And in fact, one day they cut $4 million, and the next day voted to put language in to allow the commissioner to spend that money anyway, even though they had cut it. So, they're indicating, well, if you find some money. So I had thought, in the line item that includes the Good Will-Hinckley money, and it's $67 million, they had told us that they had appropriated $1.5 million less than what was asked. So we were going to have to find $1.5 million somewhere in that account. And I remember, prior to all of this happening, in my mind, thinking that Good Will-Hinckley was going to be a really good candidate for at least some form of cut to reach that. And the reason for that was, it was the only charter school that received this kind of money. It was the only residential program that received this kind of money. And it was the only at-risk program, and there are many in the state that received this kind of money. So it was always going to be hard, I thought, for me to justify giving this money to one school when all the others would then say, hey, how come we don't get this kind of appropriation? I also knew that as many as 4 years earlier, the discussion between the governor's office then, before I was there, and Good Will-Hinckley was, this is not forever money. This is a temporary bridge money to get you until you start becoming funded as a charter school and so on. It was always in my mind that Hinckley was a candidate for at least some portion of that money we were going to have to find. So I may have said prior to this process to a lobbyist, or I don't think to Jack, that it's going to be difficult for us to get through that $1.5 million we've got to find and so on. But in relation to a conversation where I never said to Jack at that point, we're going to cut the money because of this, or the governor's told me to cut the money because of this. And, so I had conversations, I think mostly with lobbyists saying, prior to this, saying, this is money, it's going to be hard to justify. And then when all of this happened, I sort of took a, well, let's wait and see point of view and see how things work out.
Well, did you inquire of anybody on the Appropriations Committee about whether the possibility of cutting any money from Good Will-Hinckley was even on the table. And the reason I asked that question, that I don't questioning you, not answering questions,
right?
We never talked about it.
Well, and part of it, as you know, you meet a lot, you have a lot of discussions over many months. My position as commissioner and the department's position is that what matters to us is the legal document voted on by both houses of the legislature that comes to us. And that's the document we go by. The intent of the legislature is expressed by both houses voting positively to enact a budget, and it comes to us.
But those are voted on by human beings, and between the Appropriations Committee and leadership in both parties, are you aware that anyone ever suggested cutting the funding to Good Will-Hinckley?
I'm not aware, but I was also not privy to most of those conversations. I didn't listen into appropriations, and you know, things get discussed and to cut and uncut, and you know, we're often told. In this budget, for example, there was an amount of money they said you must spend, but it wasn't appropriated. So that money had to come from this account and be made up by cutting something else. So
ended up being cut from information technology.
No, again, in the budget language, all we got was a $67 million line item that was $1.5 million less than we asked. So the only official legal directive we got from the legislature was a bill voted on by both houses, overridden the governor's veto, saying you have this much money to spend in these categories. But we had one appropriation, for example, for $75,000 a year. The language was changed. You must spend this money on this program, but none was appropriated. None was added to the budget for it. So they were saying, go find the $75,000 somewhere in that miscellaneous cost. Well, that implies something that perhaps the Appropriations Committee and the legislature didn't intend to be cut would have to be cut, because that $75,000 had to come from somewhere, but it wasn't appropriated. So,
going back to your conversation with Mr. Moore, did you tell him that the funding for Good Will-Hinckley, that the $500,000 a year would be safe if the speaker was not hired as president?
He called me very late, and this is 2 days after the budget was passed in the legislature. I know that because I was on vacation on Island. When we get off the ferry, my phone rang and it was Jack. And he said, it's in the OPEGA report, words to the effect of, and I remember repeating to him, I said, if you're asking me this, and what I said was, if you're asking, will the governor be happy with Good Will-Hinckley again if if you separate yourselves from Speaker Eves? And I said, probably, because his concern with the school was that in his mind he had made a poor hire and the school would be poorly managed, and that was disappointing to him. But I didn't ever he didn't ask and I didn't put together, you know, we will definitely appropriate. At that point, we still had not, the budget had just been passed, and the department leadership needed to sit down and look at what was appropriated less in the miscellaneous costs account than we needed and where we were going to find that money. So and a number of other, the Maine School in Limestone, the School for Science and Math, and others had asked me, do we have an appropriation? And I had said, until the leadership sits down after the budget's passed and figures out where the $1.5 million is going to be cut from, I can't answer that question. So my question to Jack was, the governor will be happier with the school than he is now. But it was not tied to funding in a way, because I couldn't make that decision until we had already found $1 million.
Approximately, what was the date of that conversation?
2 days after the budget was passed, so I've forgotten. It's
around the
20-something of June, yeah.
Well, you weren't here, but I'm sure you listened in to Mr. Moore's testimony.
Yes.
And I think I'm stating this fairly, that Mr. Moore had a very clear impression from you that if the speaker were kept as president, that Good Will-Hinckley was going to lose its funding, and that if the speaker were not kept as president, that Good Will-Hinckley would get his funding. I'm sure you heard him say something.
I listened for the hour and a half or whatever that he testified. I don't remember every comment.
Well, let me just ask you, because that was the gist of what I think many of us came away with. So where did he get that idea then, that you were making it relatively clear that if the speaker were kept, the funding was gone, if the speaker was fired, the funding would be back?
I can't tell you where his impressions come from. I can tell you that my conversations did not directly link, especially the first part and the second part of your question to him. As I said, he asked, I rephrased his question to make sure we were clearly communicating when he said something to the effect of, will the governor like the school again if we, disassociate from Eves? And I said, if you're asking me, if he'll be happy with you, I think he will. He loves the school. He saved the school a few years ago, but he's not happy with his decision. If this decision weren't there, he would be happy with the school. And that was my impression, and I told him that. I don't ever recall a conversation with Jack where I said, well, you know, because you've made this decision, you're not getting the money that is in this account, or it comes from this source.
So do you think that conclusion that he drew is unfair under the circumstances?
I can't, again, I can't say where he drew his conclusion from, so I don't know whether it's fair or not. It's never my impression to communicate that. I'm pretty sure I was very careful about how I communicated that. And again, in one conversation, I restated, I said, if you're asking me this question, to make sure that my understanding and his were the same. And I said, would the governor like the school again? And I think I recall, and it's in the Opega report where it says, that also depends on who you do pick as a new president. If they're of a certain quality and so on, then that's the rub for the governor, is he wants someone running the school who's very capable and will do a great job. And I remember in that, I think it's in the report where I mentioned that piece of it. The speaker is, if you go and hire someone equally as unqualified as the speaker, he's still not going to be happy with the choice.
Do you recall the governor directing you to communicate something to Mr. Moore?
Not to Mr. Moore, no.
To anyone on this subject?
No. I mean, he never gave me instructions to communicate with anybody about anything in particular.
At any time since this review began, sir, have you been involved in any way coordinating or discussing with the governor or others in his office about what documents we would be receiving?
I think Ms. Montgomery pointed out a couple. Initially, one time I had asked her some general advice about it. When the governor's office made it clear that they were initially not going to be participating in the questioning, it became clear to me that it was not. We should not be coordinating that kind of communication. So there was one communication where I said, you know, I was asking the governor's counsel as an employee of the governor, how should I approach this? And her response was fairly, that's for you to decide. And when I understood that the governor's office was not going to participate, I realized that we were in separate boats, so to speak, and that I had to make these decisions from now on.
Okay. At any time during this process, sir, did you have any conversations with Greg Powell, the head of the Harold Alpha Foundation, or anyone else from the foundation about this subject?
No, I have not.
So I wanted to get at the end, have you produced all the records that were in response to our request to produce documents, and
yes,
copies we can keep?
Yeah, as far as I can tell, yes.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Representative Strachio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of questions. The first one relates to the miscellaneous costs. This is in the report, the miscellaneous cost elements. And on here, one of them is the Maine School for Science and Math.
Correct.
Was that payment held back?
No, it was not raised. It was not brought to my attention at the meeting when we discussed it. And even if it had, there are separate statutes outside of the budget that require that we fund the school. It's completely a state-funded school. So even if that had been the discussion, there are other statutes that prevent us from not funding.
But I'm just saying that you said anything under that miscellaneous cost element.
Right.
Okay. In fact, your own email says that it was really going to be for, I'm trying to think, I mean, there is an email that I'm assuming we have that details later that is in fact not what you ever intended to do. You knew that that cut was going to be made and recommended, and that in fact you knew where it was going to come from, and it was never going to come from.
Well, that decision,
by your own email.
Right, that decision wasn't going to be made until after the budget was passed. And it was made after the budget was passed, with the leadership of the department kind of going through the budget.
But we all know how the budget is, and when we discuss those kinds of issues, and it may only be on LCRED, but we actually discuss, okay, so we know you want to cut that, where are you going to cut it from, and we have those discussions, and we all know up front what we're going to do, and all I'm saying is, I'm asking, you never intended, those payments went out as usual. This was a totally unusual thing to request that payment be withheld. Especially since
it was the first time it had ever happened, right? But that was the only That was the only check that was raised as an issue. And it was the next day, I think, when I came back to that and said, we don't even have a budget yet. Why are we cutting checks against a budget that isn't enacted? And they said, well, that and these 2 other schools we had planned to send checks.
So this was kind of an after-the-fact thing that you were trying to look for another reason why you might have been justified in doing it?
No, I had been, again, the thoughts in my mind were that there was a strong possibility that Good Will-Hinckley, if you will, was low-hanging fruit in finding the $1.5 million we had to weeks before any mention of Speaker Eves. And
whoever gave you the idea that Good Will-Hinckley was low-hanging fruit? Because I never remember ever hearing that from anybody.
Because frequently, as I said, there's $1.5 million less in the budget. We had to find somewhere. There was a
Which
75.
You already knew where you were going to find it.
Well, someone had mentioned in passing that this was discussed perhaps in appropriations as why they had, somebody may have said, we want to cut this, so we're going to reduce it by $1.5 million. But the document, the published chaptered law that is the budget, made no mention of that. And that's the official, we can't possibly be privy to every conversation or side note or expressed opinion by someone. And we don't act on one person saying, I think, and I challenged OPEGA this in the draft, they mentioned that someone on the committee, the Appropriations Committee, said that this, one person said this, and I remember writing in the margin of the draft, the opinion of one member of one committee is not binding in law, and it doesn't direct us to do anything. So, and as I said before, they cut, one day the Appropriations Committee cut, I think it was $4 million from a similar line item, and the very next day, when they first got back as a committee, voted to allow us to spend money in those accounts if, I think the language was, if there were unspent allocations. So on one day they cut it, and the next day they said, but you can spend money in that account, yes. And the tradition, in my understanding, with the department and the legislature has been, things move around in that account based on what happens. And again, to appropriate, to tell us to spend $75,000 on something without giving us the money, clearly more than implies, in my mind, it's got to come from somewhere, and the department has to decide where, what has to be cut to do that.
So you're not saying, you're not telling me that in hindsight, you decided that that was a good reason to do it, if in fact something ever came up that you were actually trying to punish the people?
No, and I think the reason for the email you're questioning is because we were frustrated by mention, either in the committee or by a committee member, of that particular loss of money, because it was in relation to a 30-year-old computer system. And so the email might have been, this is the kind of thing that's being discussed as being cut. So.
Well, I think maybe if we had the exact wording, but that's not how it's characterized at all. I have one other question.
Yes, Rose.
On the top of page 13, and this is a long litany of what happened on that date when the governor finally found out that Speaker Eves was going to be president, and it literally goes on. And on the top of page 13, I have in my margin, when I read it the first time, this is the first real threat to Good Will-Hinckley in the report that I did. And it says, the acting DOE Commissioner, that's you, called the GWH board chair, that's Jack Moore, that morning after being called back to the governor's office. The acting commissioner explained that someone in the governor's office had looked at the makeup of the GWH means board and saw the name of one of the speaker's legislative staffers. So you were called back to the governor's office. Who did you speak to? What did they say? And then it goes on to say that the acting DOE commissioner indicated that the governor would not be happy with the school selecting the speaker, and that with cuts needed to the miscellaneous cost money in the DOE budget, it was going to be hard to justify Good Will-Hinckley keeping that money. The Good Will-Hinckley board chair informed the acting commissioner that he was going to arrange for a meeting of the Good Will-Hinckley board. Do you not think that Jack Moore came out of that conversation with you with the clear impression that the Good Will-Hinckley funding was at risk?
I can't comment on his impression. I can understand someone coming out of it with that impression.
Gee, I mean, it seems like a whole lot of people came out of all those meetings with you with that impression, and then your actions continued along the same vein. Would you not say that that's true?
I don't think my actions continued along that vein, but that's, you'd have to ask me one of the actions. So.
Thank you. Chairman Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to ask for your opinion as a citizen and as a taxpayer, not as a member of this administration. Say there was a different governor and you had a different job. Would you look at this situation and say, yeah, that's fine, that's appropriate for a chief executive to insert him or herself into the internal affairs of an independent institution?
I take issue with a number of pieces of your question. Part of the school, part of the program that is Good Will-Hinckley, and the part that was to receive this funding is a public school. It's a charter school by legal definition in Maine. Those are public schools, publicly funded. And so this money was going from an account that's within the governor's discretion to a public school. So I'm not sure I would characterize it as interfering with a private organization. These are public students paid for by public money going to a public school. From my point of view and the history of the back and forth, this is money, as I've mentioned, that is within the, I should say, executive branch's discretion to make adjustments to. The governor has from the time, again, as a citizen observing, reading the newspaper, the governor has from the time he ran for city council been adamant about the proper use and investment of taxpayer dollars, and that they go to good programs and not bad programs, effective programs, not wasteful programs. And as a citizen reading the newspaper, I would say that the governor's point of view on this was that this was no longer a good investment for taxpayer dollars because it was going to be a poorly run school that made a poor decision. And there are lots of other at-risk kids in Maine that this money could have been diverted to. There are only 80 students involved in this funding, and $500,000 can, in some other case, go a much longer way for many other students. And so, again, as a citizen, I would suspect, having read what I read about the governor, that he looked upon this as no longer a good investment of this money, and it should go somewhere else.
Representative DeShane.
Thank you, Senator. And thank you again for being with us.
Believe me, it's good to be here.
Okay, we have in the OPEGA report a timeline where the governor has a conversation with you that says he doesn't want to pay any money not legally required by law. Later, a payment is withheld. Later, the governor tells Channel 8, I did it, why wouldn't I? Is that timeline accurate?
The events happened in that order, yes.
Is there anything else in that timeline that I should try to remember?
Other than, we mentioned at the cabinet meeting, I mean, not that we haven't already discussed.
Okay. Well, the governor did have that conversation where he doesn't want to pay any money not legally required by law. He has that for you. So you know the funding isn't questioned for that reason. Your testimony to us now seems to be that budget cuts were the threat to Good Will-Hinckley, at least that was conveyed to the board that way, even though you know from the governor that he's specifically linking these two.
Prior to, actually, that conversation with the governor happened, as I said before, I believe on the 9th. My discussion with Jack was on the 5th. And so I was conveying to him, what had been in my mind for a long time, we're going to have to really sharpen our pencil after the budget's passed as a leadership in the department and find $1.5 million. And that was part of my thinking all along through the process. This then came along and added to that. Now, granted, the governor's dissatisfaction with Hinckley was one of the things we were going to have to consider when we sat down after the budget was passed and had that conversation.
And so it seems like the governor's dissatisfaction with the higher marquees was the trigger for everything that came after that, specifically to the withholding of this funding.
No, it had nothing, well, it had very little to do with, and I want to characterize, the funding was never cut or withheld. At that meeting of the leadership team, I mentioned to the group assembled in the department that the governor had spoken at a cabinet meeting about an issue relating to education. So I generally want to keep them informed. You'll read about this in the paper here at the situation. Susan Bowden, our financial person, we were looking over and she had a strange look on her face and she said, we've just cut them a check. Should I pull it? And if the governor had instructed me, he was unaware for 3 weeks after that there was a check. No one in the governor's office instructed us to pull a check. They weren't aware there was a check. I wasn't aware there was a check until she said, we just ordered a check, should I pull it? I paused for a long time, which was unnecessary if the governor had said, you will not send a check. I'd have said, yes, pull the check. Instead, in my thinking, I got to find $1.5 million in this budget if it passes as it is. And we have not sat down as a group and figured that out, and we won't until the legislature concludes its part of the process. The governor had heard that morning officially that Good Will-Hinckley had officially signed the contract or hired the speaker, and his initial reaction was, I don't want them to get any money that isn't locked in law. But 3 or 4 more weeks were going to pass before that decision had to be made. I didn't have to decide at that moment whether or not to send the money to Good Will-Hinckley. Sending that check would have made that decision. And it wasn't time to make that decision yet. And as I tried to explain in the letter I sent last time, I knew that lots of things could happen in the next couple of weeks. And I don't have to make the decision until the next couple of weeks have passed. So to allow the check to go out that day would have made the decision, and I can't undo it. I don't know whether the legislature might change its mind. I don't know whether the governor might change his mind. I don't know where we're going to find $1.5 million. And until I know those things, I don't want to make a decision about sending $500,000 out the door. I want all the information I can, and I didn't have it that day. And so I said, let's hold it. I remember very clearly in my mind thinking, once we send the check out, we have no legal authority to get it back. We could say, please send it back, and they say no. So sending it out now it made the decision, which there wasn't time to make. It was much easier to just say, well, we'll send it next week. Just hold the paperwork, and when we get more information that we're satisfied gives us what we need to make the right call, then we'll send the check. Now, I think what's key to this idea of threat that I think people are missing, we never notified Good Will-Hinckley that this payment had been pulled. As Mr. Moore said at your meeting last time, and it's in the report, he was not expecting it. He said, we had until July 1st to make a decision. We were waiting for that date. So at no time did anyone communicate, either to the governor or to Good Will-Hinckley, that they weren't getting this money. Because, and that to me makes the absence of a threat. I mean, if you're going to threaten someone, you have to tell them. And for this holding of this check while we waited for more information could only have been a threat if I had picked up the phone and said to Jack, ha, we just pulled your check and hung up on him. And I never did. And he wasn't aware, as he said in testimony. We had until July 1st, which is the beginning of the fiscal year. So this was not a, we didn't pick up the phone and call the governor and say, ha, we stopped the check. Because it wasn't a big deal. It was, let's wait until more information becomes available. Including the very real possibility that the governor, 2 hours after he heard that Hinckley had officially hired Eves, that he said, I don't want them to get the money. In the course of 3 weeks, he could change his mind and say, yeah, go ahead and send him the money. So even if that were the only issue, and it wasn't resolved, it wasn't settled. And until the budget was passed and the time came to decide what to do with a miscellaneous account, and we made a decision, I wasn't ready to say, send the money and that's the decision. So there are a number of things, including the governor's reticence to send the money, that weighed in on that. But it wasn't, I didn't take out the big budget book and draw a great red line through it saying, this funding will never go. I just said, let's wait until we get more information. And as I tried to express in the letter I sent last month, it turns out in those 3 weeks some really important things happened, including the fact that we had no written agreement with Hinckley on how they could or could not spend the money, which is kind of important. It occurred to me about an hour later that the legislature hadn't even passed the budget yet, so we're essentially writing a check that isn't supported in budget. And we got a note that was expressed to the Ethics Committee from Hinckley that said, we don't really need the money, it wouldn't affect us negatively in any way, which is something we would have considered at the meeting we defined the $1.5 million. So all those things happened afterward, and what I was saying in the letter was, I was waiting for more information, and some of the more information was really important. I was glad that I waited for more information. So the check was, the money wasn't withheld, the school wasn't threatened with the withholding of money. We simply said, let's wait until they're not expecting the check today, let's wait a couple of weeks until we learn what happens in a number of different issues, and then we'll decide whether the check should go.
Okay, certainly what we get in the OPEGA brief and what we got in testimony from the other parties at Good Will-Hinckley School felt there was a threat. And the testimony we get today from the governor's office, essentially from the administration, is we didn't intend that threat be clearly financial on this part. So the testimony in front of us seems to be that there was a misunderstanding. The understanding from that entire end of the equation was there was a threat. At any time, did you discuss with Good Will-Hinckley, Jack Moore, or anybody else on the board that there was no written agreement in place governing the use of funds, and that's why there was a question, or?
When not then, when I discovered that, as we got closer to having to make that decision, I said, okay, what's to prevent them from spending this on furniture or whatever, as opposed to the residential program? So I went through the files. I'd only been in the department less than 6 months, and found that we had no contractual memorandum of agreement or contract or anything for the 2 years previous, and we'd sent them over $1 million in that period of time. So I said, we need a document, and then began discussing with the, after Richard left, Mr. Moore, Mr. Moody, the new president. We can't just give you the money without any, parameters around which.
But all that happened after the impression of a threat was gotten by the receiving party.
I don't think it was an impression. As everyone has said, the governor stated publicly. So I think a lot of what folks at Good Will-Hinckley saw as a threat didn't come from us not pulling a check and not telling them, or a conversation one of us had with them. The governor, as you pointed out, specifically stated it. So if they got the impression there was a threat, it was communicated very clearly from people other than those of us who were working day to day on it.
Certainly we'll hear from Ms. Vanderwood later on about what she conveyed to her clients at the time, that the funding is in jeopardy. So the threat was perceived rather strongly, I guess, on the receiving end.
And again, publicly stated, I don't believe, not in conversations I had, and I don't believe in conversations other people had.
Thank you. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to walk through that timeline a little bit, briefly, that decision we're discussing. And I'd like to start with the comment that the governor made to you regarding not providing any funding that's not legally required. And that was in the cabinet meeting on June 9th?
I believe right after the cabinet meeting.
Right after the cabinet meeting.
Yeah.
And did you understand that to be referring to funding for Good Will-Hinckley?
Yes. Because he was discussing to that.
So the topic of discussion was Good Will-Hinckley, and then he said not providing any of the funding not legally required. You understood that to be directed. He was telling you to do that.
No, well, he was expressing his opinion, but as I said, this was an hour and a half.
Let me ask it another way. Did you ever consider that that was something which you should not execute at every opportunity?
No, I think it was something I should take under advisement. But again, I had weeks before I had to decide whether to act on his opinion. And in 2 or 3 weeks, his opinion could have changed. This was 2 hours after he learned they have, in fact, signed a contract with Speaker Eves. He was unhappy with that, and he said, I don't want this to happen. I have many times seen the governor and myself and everybody else change their mind 2 or 3 or 4 days after an event that creates a response like that. In my mind, I would have waited, I was waiting until the day we had to make that decision. And if he was of that mindset, I would have said, you've asked me not to spend any money that isn't required in law. Do you still feel that way? I've done that with the governor on a whole bunch of issues.
Let me ask that another way, because obviously people can change their mind, but until they do, what they say, if they're someone that you are directly responsible to, and you take your orders from, says, do something, do you understand that that means you do it?
I understand that those are my orders until they otherwise change, yeah.
And did those orders change between your speaking immediately after the cabinet meeting and your subsequent Department of Education lead meeting?
No, it did not.
I also want to go back for a moment, because this, for me, as not only a legislator but a member of the public and trying to represent public interest, I find it difficult to understand why anything other than that conversation would have led you to even considering whether to hold that meeting. I want to point out that in an email later in the month, you characterized the $1.5 million cut for miscellaneous costs in this way. This is on the first paragraph on page 20, which there's a copy of in front of you if you're interested. You said they also cut $1.5 million for miscellaneous costs directly, which was for our 30-year-old certification system.
Mm-hmm.
So this doesn't say which we decided to cut from our 30-year-old certification system. You're indicating, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you understood the legislative intent for that $1.5 million being cut, that it was for the 30-year-old certification system.
In my mind, legislative intent can only be expressed by a vote of both bodies, not by a comment by one member of one committee.
Then I would ask you, where did you get the impression that you voiced in this email?
I don't recall, but probably from a
that
comment
aspect?
from a member of the committee in a discussion. I did listen in occasionally to the appropriations discussions.
So you considered that sufficiently indicative of legislative intent that you voiced this as the reason for the cut in your subsequent email?
I think what I was expressing was a frustration with we still can't replace a 30-year-old computer system.
But that isn't what your email said.
But I can point out that in our discussions about the budget and that account, we funded the $1.5 million for the computer system because we found it critical. So we found a way to move money around and finance that project. So if our intent was, if I believe the intent of the legislature was not to, I would not have done that. But the only expression of the intent of the legislature we can legally consider is the chaptered law voted on by both bodies, not a passing comment or something said on in a committee meeting. Our guidance has to come from law, not from what we perceive as an opinion of one or many members.
Right. So let me state that another way. You were aware of that statement by the legislature, whether you considered that binding intent or not.
Right.
And you communicated that in the subsequent email on the 27th.
Mm-hmm.
When you went into the Department of Education lead meeting, immediately after your conversation with the governor in which you received his direction not to provide any funding not legally required, was, gee, I'd like to fund the 30-year-old certification system, let's hang on to this money, what was going on in your mind at that time? Or was the conversation you had just had with the governor directing you not to send Good Will-Hinckley any money that we're not required to do by law?
That conversation was one of the things clearly in my mind. If it had been the dominant thing in my mind, I would not have hesitated. I would have said to Mrs. Bowden, yes, go pull the check now. But as everyone who spoke with OPEGA about it has testified, I paused for a very long time to ponder what to do. And one of the things I kept in mind was we have 3 more weeks, or so many, until the fiscal year begins. The governor, like other human beings, often changes his mind on issues like this, and he had just heard about this that morning and still was, I don't want to say emotionally, but somewhat charged up about that particular decision. And at some point in the future, he could change his mind. And at the same time, I've got to find $1.5 million. I've got to do a number of other things. So what went through my mind was, I am not ready to make this decision this morning. And sending the check means I've made the decision. And I can't undo that unless Good Will-Hinckley decides to, out of their goodness of their hearts, to send back the check after we tell them we send it in error. So I said, I'm not ready to make that. Let's wait. And as we gain more information, including the possibility the governor could change his mind, then we will make the decision with all of that information. But 3 weeks before the beginning of the fiscal year was not a time to start making hard decisions on where the next fiscal year's money was going.
And yet there were other checks cut at that time.
I found out subsequently.
Which were not obligated to be sent by law until the budget in the new fiscal year began, correct?
Again, I was not aware of that at the time I made the decision. And yes, they were obligated to be sent in law other than the budget.
But
those two
that's
schools,
not the question I asked.
Right.
We're not obligated to be sent until the new fiscal year.
That's correct.
And so when it was pointed out that you had an opportunity to not send a check before it was expected, you didn't ask whether there were other checks that this would be early to send. That wasn't going through your mind whether this has to be done now. What was going through your mind was that this was regarding Good Will-Hinckley, with which you just had a discussion with the governor.
Right. And I was not in a position we are legally obligated by law to send the money to the other two schools.
But not
I have no
until later,
discretion.
which is what you just communicated to me
And
regarding.
about I think it was an hour or two after this discussion, I had a discussion with Ms. Bowden about, and she pointed out, we've also, sent these other two checks. And my question was, we don't have a budget yet, why are we doing this? She said, well, we've kind of done it that way for a long time. And I said, I'd have to go back and ask past commissioners and others, or you can ask Ms. Bowden, she's 35 years she's been there. So I immediately said to her, we're not going to send checks any longer against the budget that hasn't been passed. That was not on my mind a couple hours earlier, the day earlier when I made the decision. But as soon as I became aware that there were two other instances where we sent early checks, I'd say, not anymore, we're not going to do that. Until we have a budget, we don't write a check against the budget, because the legislature could eliminate all those funds after the check's gone. So I was not aware that those other two checks had come up until later, and as soon as I found out about them, I said, we're not going to do that. It's no longer the policy of the department to do that.
So you just communicated that it was not on your mind 2 hours earlier whether we had to provide these payments now.
Whether the budget
had
passed or not.
You had provided that as part of your justification for the decision earlier today in your testimony.
No, what I said was that I decided not to send the check after some thought, because there were things that I'm sure will come up in the next 3 weeks that I don't know yet. And I don't have to send the check today. It's not in law that I have to. It's not a rule that I have to. The department had chosen to without my knowledge. They brought it to my attention, and I said, there's no reason to send this check today. Good Will-Hinckley isn't aware that it's coming. I don't have a reason to get it to them. The fiscal year is a ways off. So I said, let's wait until the time passes and things happen during that time and make a decision from an informed position.
Had you not had the conversation with the governor just before that meeting, saying not to send Good Will-Hinckley money not required by law, would you have ever gotten to this discussion with your staff about sending Good Will-Hinckley money and canceled that check?
I don't know that. The question is whether the staff would have informed me that there was a check en route. And without having this conversation, I don't know whether they would have or not. The reason this came up is I said that there's an issue between the speaker and the governor over an education matter you read about in the paper. And it's because I raised that, she said, we've already sent them a check, we ordered a check, should we stop it or pull it?
So I might, one last thing then, I want to clarify something. Your discussion of that the matter which might come up in the papers you wanted your staff to know about, did you, when you communicated that to them, indicate what the governor had just instructed you, that we are to send no money to Good Will-Hinckley that is not required by law?
I don't recall, it's possible, but I don't believe I did, I don't recall that I did, but if others at the meeting said that that's what I did, then it wasn't, my recollection of that wasn't strong because it just was, I'd gone from one meeting to another. So I honestly don't recall if I said that the governor has said not a dime, that isn't in law.
So you believe that while talking about his displeasure with Good Will-Hinckley, not having mentioned the order from the governor regarding funding, did someone on your staff volunteer that there's money going to Good Will-Hinckley that we could stop? Should we?
Again, it's possible that we had that discussion. I did not then say to the staff, don't send any money before it was raised that there was a check. But I know that prevalent in my mind was the idea that it was not the day to make that decision. That we had weeks to go before making the decision as to whether, and frankly, the context of any of the funding for things in the miscellaneous cost account should all be done on the same day in relation to all of the things in it. And that couldn't be done, didn't need to be done until later. And so to individually pluck off, we're going to spend this one and not this one, and then later go, well, we should have had that as a whole discussion of everything in the account, it's too late to undo that. So my thinking was, I don't have to make this decision today. I don't have all the information I'm sure I will have in another couple of weeks. I can always send them a check next week if we get more information, so let's hold the check.
And I understand and I appreciate your subsequent decision that we should be providing funding after it's actually authorized. However, the series of events here and what directed you to considering whether to cancel that check is another matter entirely than whether our procedures are in the time frame and exercising the responsibilities that we should be exercising. Thank you.
Representative Campbell?
Thank you. There's this little comment that keeps bubbling up or not about Good Will-Hinckley really didn't need the money. Are you aware of the source, the cause, the timeline of that?
That's information that came from the treasurer of the school, at least as he's listed on the website, the vice president of finance and operations. My understanding from the Pega report is the speaker asked the ethics commission for a letter or advice on whether or not he should participate in the budget discussions, having been offered the job and subsequently accepting it. This was on sometime around the 11th, somewhere between 11th and 15th of June, if I remember right. And the response, the head of the ethics commission in his letter said, I've interviewed, spoken with the, what I call the treasurer, because that's what the website calls him, the vice president of finance, not whatever. And he says that this, let me read it because the Good Will-Hinckley director of finance, who had consulted with the school's director of admissions, because with a charter school, the number of students you admit affects your funding, believed that the loss of the funding would have no significant impact on the number of students attending the school and would not expect a change in the salary of any manager or laying off of any faculty or administrative staff. The other programs at Good Will-Hinckley, such as the Glen Stratton Learning Center and the College Step-Up program, would continue as well. So the information directly from what they described as the treasurer of the organization, who was, I would assume, more in a position to understand the finances of the school and the effect of a loss of $500,000 per year on the school, said, this won't affect us at all, to the Ethics Commission in response to that request. And they wrote that letter in their advice back to Speaker Eames. So about 3 days after, somewhere between 2 and 6 days after the cabinet meeting and my discussion with the lead team staff, it was the opinion of the treasurer of the school that this money will affect us, the loss of this money will affect us in a negative way. And that was one of the pieces of information that I learned subsequently about, which would have borne out on our decision whether or not some of that $1.5 million would have to come from the Good Will-Hinckley part of the appropriation.
Thank you. Representative Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for. Does the governor, you've been in the governor's office and in the Department of Education for a while now. Mm-hmm. In your experience, does the governor interfere in hiring decisions by school districts of superintendents or principals? Is that something he sort of regularly does or has ever done, to your knowledge?
I can't say ever done. I mean, I can't say regularly, and I don't have, my history with him was only a few years, but it's also important to keep in mind this is a school that exists because he saved it. 3 or 4 years ago, he went to bat for the school, spoke publicly about it. As they called it, the LePage miracle at Hinckley. Because of his background, he wanted this at-risk program at Good Will-Hinckley and the school itself to continue, with caveats that the state was not going to keep sending this money forever, that this was a bridge to 2 years, 3 years to get back on your feet. So this is a different situation in that this is money the governor went out of his way to make sure the school got. Not all the other schools like it, but this one, because of after 100 and some odd years of the good work they had done there, they were of the opinion, Speaker Cummings or President Cummings were of the opinion that they would need this until the charter school part of the funding got underway. And so this is an unusual circumstance in that this is something the governor had gone to bat for with the school to get the funding. Thanks. And there's at no time during all this sequence of events did you never thought this might be sort of a threat? I mean, you had weeks to decide, you said, whether or not to send the check, but you called them and you told them or suggested that their funding was at risk. How's that not a threat? Again, any conversation that I might have had and might have said, this is one of the issues I'm going to have to consider, was outweighed by the clear, obvious statement by the governor of the threat. So I can't weed out whether their impression of a threat came from me or from someone else or from. I'm saying that I was waiting for the decision, which was when we get together as a leadership of the department, the budget's done, we've got to figure out where the $1.5 million comes from and all that other kind of stuff. And we needed to do that as a whole after the fact. And as I pointed out, we eventually decided that we would send all $530,000 to Good Will-Hinckley for the next 2 years.
Thank you. Representative DeShane.
Yes, thank you again. We've been skirting around the edges of my confusion on the timeline. You state as one of your rationale for the decision on June 9th not to forward payment was that they didn't need the funds. But you didn't discover that until 6 days later?
Again, as I said in my letter, what I said was, what I tried to say, and forgive me if I didn't word it eloquently, I was trying to provide some context. I said, I knew things were going to happen in the next 3 weeks that would bear on this. And then I tried to explain for it, and it turns out they did, and here are some of them, including, it dawned on me that we didn't have a budget yet, including Hinckley saying we didn't need the money, including my discovery we didn't have a written agreement. And I ended that letter by saying, so as it turns out, that was a sound decision.
That's, I think, what I was expecting for clarification, and I appreciate it. Thanks. I guess the question I would then have is, do you look at the need for funds on every check you send out? Do you make that assessment before you send out checks to anybody, or is it just this one case?
I do now, and there are that many zeros after it. But it's a department with over $1 billion budget, and most of that goes out to schools monthly in the form of checks. So I don't check. The formula decides this is what a school gets, the check goes out. But when we've taken a number of steps to tighten up contracting, and we just recently asked the staff that put a little sort of checkbox next to who's seen this before it gets to the commissioner's office, and as the leader of the team look at it, not just somebody kind of put. So
does the recipient of funds have to certify to you they need the money now, or how's it work?
Anytime I got to find $1.5 million in a budget and someone says we don't really need it, that's going to bear on the decision.
They proactively have to tell you that you don't need it, or do you check?
I don't have to, but I'm sure if as Senator Cates will tell you, if someone came to the Appropriations Committee or somehow it communicated to them in the midst of a budget discussion, this isn't really that important to us, it's going to get a lot more scrutiny than somebody who didn't say that.
Which Good Will-Hinckley didn't do. That came out later.
Well, they came out before we made the decision as to whether or not, as to where that money should go, whether or not we would get the money.
Eventually.
July 7th, I think, was the date we sat down.
But this was after the speaker was fired.
It was, yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Senator Diamond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to just get a little bow around this if I can, because we can't be there. First, did you know on the 22nd of May that the board had just voted 7 days prior to hire?
No.
So when you were offered the job 3 times, you didn't realize that they'd already made a decision?
I didn't. I wouldn't characterize it as being offered a job, except when someone says that 3 times, I mean, even the folks at Opega burst out laughing when I said, and then the 3rd time I finally realized there was something there.
So would you consider yourself, and it's fair to say, that you were the conduit between, on this issue, between the governor and the chair of the board and the board itself?
Yeah, reluctantly, in a way reluctantly so. When I was no longer the policy advisor for the governor, it was a bit of a transition because it takes a while to get up to speed, especially during a session. And so we were kind of helping the new policy advisor get on board. But when Mr. Moore asked me to come to lunch, I knew he was chair of a board of a public school that got public money, and a K through 12 school, which bears on the work that the commissioner does. So I said, sure, I'll go to lunch. But it wasn't until we sat down that I had any idea what the lunch was going to be about or what the discussion would be. And it certainly wasn't until the Opega report that when he left the office to come meet with me, someone else left the office to offer the speaker the job. I wasn't aware of that until way
So you were clear of the governor's position, and you were clear of your own words, the governor's threat, yes?
With Jack on the 22nd, or?
No, just after that.
Yeah, can you ask it? Sorry.
Yeah, you were clear of the position the governor had taken on this issue.
On the morning of the 9th, he made that clear, right?
If nothing else, by looking at what's in the news reports, you know that the governor had made the threat, yes?
Yes.
And then when you kept, your testimony today is you kept saying the governor will like you if you don't do this again.
He'll be happy with the school if, and I put, it's in the report, I'm sure, I put the caveat, if you choose not to continue with the speaker and find someone who is qualified and capable of being effective at the school. Words to that effect.
Okay. So you knew about the threat, you knew, and then when the speaker was fired, and then you liked the school again as a result of that. Is that a fair chronology?
Yeah, I mean, that's the chronology, but again, the issue was, the governor wanted the school to succeed after all the work he had done to bring back from the dead, if you will. And he didn't believe, I can't say what he believed. My impression was, he wanted someone who was really good to run the school, and after all the work we'd done to save it, not have it go down the tubes.
And the board voting unanimously didn't have an impact on his feeling.
On the governor's feelings?
Yeah. The board,
I
when
don't
they
believe
voted
so.
unanimously to hire the speaker, that did not influence the governor in terms of his opinion to hire.
No, I don't think it did, no. Because he was aware that both boards had voted unanimously.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Stracchio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I got to go back to this question of finance person because I can't understand why, if you believe after the fact, of course, because that letter did come after the threat was already made, that they didn't need the money, then why did you give them the money on July 1st? Why did you give it to them at all?
Because as a result of this process with the speaker, we discovered, unbeknownst to us, that the loss of this money would in fact, in the words of people from the school, including Mr. Moore last month, would cause the end of the school, would cause the school to go under. And that was not, which is the reason they acted as they did. That was not something anybody wanted. And when we realized that the loss of this funding would have, rather than having no impact at all on the school, would suddenly have a devastating effect on the school that all of us want to continue, and the work that it does to continue, and the students to continue to benefit, then it was a different situation. But so I set out and talked with President Moody at that time, saying there's a very clear trail of evidence going back to Speaker Cummings that this money was never supposed to still be going on. It was supposed to have stopped after the second year, and now we're about to start year 5 and 6.
But excuse me, but that was all after the fact. We're talking about what happened in these months before it all became public, and you're talking like everybody knew that, and they didn't. You're the only ones that knew what was going on. So you can't really say after the fact, oh, well, they found out about it. Good Will-Hinckley found it was in jeopardy because it was in public, and the governor said that. They already knew it was in jeopardy because they were already having these discussions in all kinds of meetings.
All I can tell you is I was not aware it was happening. And the only public communication...
How is that possible? I'm sorry.
Let him finish his answer.
All I knew about, I don't get into the inner workings of the finances of every school and school district in Maine. It's 170,000 students, 247 school districts. But the communication to us, the first knowledge we had of, this is important because it helps the residential program, which is an important part. And it would be my assumption that without the money for the residential program, the kids would have to commute from home instead of living on campus. And that was a significant thing. Until the treasurer, speaking on behalf of the board, presumably the smartest person when it comes to the finances of Good Will-Hinckley, said, we don't really need the money. It won't affect us. While there were conversations, apparently, according to Mr. Moore, going on saying this is going to be the end of the school, which I learned reading the Opega report, or actually I learned from media reports when the Alphon Foundation said, we're not going to put our money in as a result of that. So this process caused, I wasn't aware the Alphon Foundation was funding anything at Good Will-Hinckley, or that the amount would be so detrimental to the school. This process made us aware that our money would lead to the loss of the Alphon money, which would lead to the loss of the school. And that changed our opinion of whether we should fund this. And again, I said to the school, we will basically reset our relationship back 4 years. You have a year to figure out how to live without this money, or we won't send you the second year of the budget. And even if you do, the second year is the last year you're going to get money, which was the posture of the administration 4 years prior. And nothing changed in that way to get the school back weaned off, if you will, of this money. So our decision was, we don't want the school to end. We'll give you 2 more years to figure it out, but you cannot go on with this money forever.
I apologize to you. I just want to follow up with another question, because you spoke about the process. I'm from a school district that's a really high receiver of state aid education. I was on the school board for 12 years and hired at least 3 or 4 superintendents. And in that process, the governor and the Department of Education, the commissioner, never inserted themselves between the school board and the hiring process of the superintendent, which was the most important position in our school district, and the only one that the school board really had any say over. much the same way that the Good Will-Hinckley board had say over who the president was going to be. And we received a whole lot more money than Good Will-Hinckley ever did. So what's different about those things? Is it that if the governor expresses interest or he supports it, and then if you do something that he doesn't like, that you take that away? I mean, what is it about this process that was so different that the governor thought he had the right to insert himself into the hiring of a president or a private board?
I can't tell you what was in the governor's mind or why his opinion of that was different from another. I would say you'd have to ask him, but I know that would be met with a few troubles from the board. So.
Did you feel that you did that as well in threatening to withhold the funding?
I did not threaten to withhold the funding. I did not communicate to Good Will-Hinckley that we were threatening to withhold the funding.
Okay.
Thank you. Representative Sanderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here today. Do public schools, such as what Representative Stracchio was just speaking about, do they receive extra funding for special projects out of the miscellaneous account?
There are competitive grants. There are, if you do this, we'll help fund it, meaning any school who accomplishes this will get the money. But there's not a, let's say, $530,000 fund that goes to the school specifically for keeping the school in business, which is what initially was the reason for the contract.
Okay. And the other two schools, the Maine School for Science and Mathematics, the Maine Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, those we are statutorily required to fund because we own those schools. Okay? Do we own the Center for Excellence Speakers? No. We do not own them. They still receive the standard funding as all do other public schools.
They get an amount per pupil that registers in the charter school from the state.
Thank you. All right, and just one other area I would like to address here. I'd like to go back to May 22nd when you had a meeting with the Good Will-Hinckley board chair, and I'm going to read here saying the acting commissioner also told OPEGA that Good Will-Hinckley board chair described to him the speaker's responses to a couple of questions asked in the speaker's interviews with Good Will-Hinckley. The Good Will-Hinckley board chair told him that the speaker said he would not only be busy for 3 days a week with his work as a speaker during the session, and that he and the governor were on good terms. And then down to the next one, he said, he indicated to OPEGA that he had reservations, the Good Will-Hinckley board chair is who I'm speaking of, that he had reservations about hiring the speaker despite his vote at the May 15th Good Will-Hinckley board meeting. Did he share with you what those reservations were?
I don't think he enunciated them specifically. My very clear impression from the lunch, I can tell you under oath here today, was that he was not happy about hiring the speaker. And he was looking for some alternative other than doing so. And he asked me for names. He expressed whether I was interested. The purpose of the lunch, as I perceived it very clearly, was the search committee has arrived at these two names, and I don't like either of them. I got to do something. Can you give me some advice?
Even after it had been voted on unanimously on 15th.
Which I wasn't aware of till later, but yeah. I mean, I wasn't aware, or that someone was then en route to meet the speaker and offer him the job. I just know that he expressed to me great displeasure with the speaker as the next president.
And he did not articulate to you any of the reasons why?
We had a general discussion about that, and I think it was, some of them were my ideas and some were his. I don't remember specifically if he said it was this or this. But generally, he was very displeased with the thought of having to hire a speaker.
Did he indicate to you at all about how the governor may react to the hiring of speakers?
No, I mean, he didn't ask. I just expressed my opinion, and again, I was effectively dropping back in my old role as the senior policy advisor for education. And I said to him, he lives 2 hours away, he's speaker, he's opposed charter schools vehemently for 4 years now. He has a young family. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why Hinckley was looking clearly and it turns out they had expressed all of these very strong exceptions 2 weeks earlier. They were looking for someone who was a way more than full-time person, late at night, traveling, press events and all that. And any sitting Speaker of the House was simply not capable of giving that kind of time to a school. And someone who lived roughly 2 hours away, who was prohibited from moving by the fact that he was in the legislature, was not the person who could spend long hours in the wee hours of the morning benefiting the school. So that was the back and forth discussion we had, and so I expressed those to him, and I assume that he took those as the governor's point of view too, and it turns out in the governor's public letter they were roughly the same issues that I raised.
Did he indicate though that he understood that after being such a tremendously stalwart supporter and of the school and fighting for this school and funding for this school in the implementation, I believe it was in the 125th, where the speaker was a vocal and vigorous opponent. Did he indicate to you that this might not go over well?
Did Mr. Moore do that?
Yeah.
He may have. Most of it was him asking my opinion and mine saying, this to me sounds like for these reasons not a great idea. One of the things I was having difficulty with is I can't right now, off the top of my head, come up with a name who is so much better than the speaker that it would trump the work of the search committee. And I got the impression that's what he was looking for, someone so great that he could go back to the board and say, I know you did all this work, but look at this great person. And I said, I don't have that person for it. I can't think of it.
Did you ask him if they, in regard to the other applicants, there were 19 in all, correct? Or 19?
That's what I've read, yeah.
I mean, did you ask him what the qualifications were for the other individuals, and whether there was anybody who may have been, who actually did have educational background, the superintendent background?
I didn't. But I did voice that the speaker's never run a school and so on. But I didn't ask him more about the other candidates. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Desjardins, so I want to go back for a moment to the checks. And so this is a practice that has been in place for decades, you said.
It may have been, yeah.
And so for the years that this check was being cut to Good Will-Hinckley, when would they have been receiving that check?
The next person on the batting order here is the best person to answer that question. After 35 years in the department, I'm sure Ms. Golden could give you that history. I don't.
Normally, given that we're talking about stopping a check which was already in the works on the 9th, you would expect that before the end of the month of June, they would have received such a check in past years.
They may have, but I think they were on their third financial officer and their third president in the matter of 2 years. So I don't think that institutional knowledge was necessarily there. All I can say is that at the last meeting and in the OPEGA report, Mr. Moore said we knew we had until July 1st. So nothing in his testimony to OPEGA or to you indicated that the absence of the check raised some alarm, or they according to his testimony, didn't seem to be expecting it. And we certainly didn't communicate to them that it's not coming.
So I guess maybe I'll have to ask the question later and find out when they normally would be receiving that. But something changed in Good Will-Hinckley's impression of whether the threat was serious between when they hired and subsequently moved ahead with signing papers with the speaker, which I believe happened after your conversations, after the June 9th cabinet. It happened actually much closer to the end of the month.
I just remember that morning there was a public announcement in the Bangor Daily News that the speaker had been chosen as it became official and publicly announced.
Something happened between then and when the board decided that they had no other choice but to fire Speaker Eves based on the perceived threat. And I think it's this committee's responsibility to understand what happened. That is part of answering the question about what happened with the funding and the understanding of the reasons for that funding. So, do you have anything else you can tell us regarding communication, whether it's directly to Good Will-Hinckley or anywhere else regarding the cancellation of that check?
No, and as I said, it was not, the decision was not they are not going to ever receive funding. The decision was today's not the day to make that decision. Now is not the time to send a check. So when Susan said to me, should we pull the check, I pondered it for a while and finally said, yeah, we better not. I mean, we better pull it and hold on to it.
So you're saying are you aware of any communication by you or any of the Department of Education staff informing Good Will-Hinckley that the check was not required to be issued till July 1st?
The only other piece of information other than what we've all read in the paper is an incredibly erroneous newspaper article that tried to describe those events based on the testimony of one anonymous source that wasn't present for any of the meetings, and said that someone was called to the governor's office in order to pull the check and so on. Almost nothing in that article was accurate. We informed the reporter that it was inaccurate, and it ran anyway. And since then, most of your knowledge and our conversations have been around this erroneous newspaper article, which is, wrong wholesale, and in my opinion, not being a journalist, to base an entire newspaper article on one anonymous source without backup or confirmation explains why we're having so much discussion about something that didn't happen. So that came out, I forgot what date that article came out, maybe the 22nd, somewhere in there. That may have, I'm sure Good Will-Hinckley read that, and that was the first. I think anybody but those of us in the room knew about the check being pulled. And as Mr. Chadbourne testified, he didn't know about it. Cynthia Montgomery testified she didn't know about it until the article came out. We didn't cut the check and then tell everybody. So therefore, we didn't consummate the threat. It's much like, if I'm going to threaten you and I don't tell you about it, you're not going to feel very threatened. So we did not communicate in any way to Good Will-Hinckley that we pulled this check, because by the time we did, we might have been ready to send it.
So we've heard testimony from Good Will-Hinckley and reported by various parties in this report that they understood what the governor's displeasure to mean funding be withheld. Furthermore, there was in that newspaper article on the 22nd information that a check was canceled, which if they were to check their files and find that that check ordinarily was received by them already and now subsequent to the threat has not been received by Good Will-Hinckley. Can you envision someone not considering that as a heightening of the threat?
If it were me at Good Will-Hinckley, I'd have picked up the phone and called the source of the check and said, is this true? Is the check coming? What's the status of that? But no one at Good Will-Hinckley contacted the department, as far as I know, and asked, is this true, and are we not getting the check? Has a decision been made? If they had, I would have said, no, we simply haven't made the decision yet, and we won't until the fiscal year begins.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Tom, for hanging in. Sure. I hope you're feeling all right.
Yeah.
Has the $530,000 in state funds now gone to Good Will-Hinckley?
The first quarterly payment, was paid in quarters, was sent. We signed a new agreement between myself and the president, and the check went, I think, around the 10th of July, somewhere in there.
Has a new president been hired, to your knowledge?
I have no idea. I don't believe so, because, well, it's been a few weeks, but the last contact I had was with the
Is the governor getting involved in that decision?
I have no idea.
Thank you.
Representative Stracchio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a couple of questions around Mr. Moore and his testimony. Because listening to you, the way that meeting, that lunch meeting, Mr. Moore sounds like he didn't really expect, didn't want Speaker Eves to be the president of Good Will-Hinckley. I want you to know that we heard him, and maybe he wasn't under oath, but he clearly did not give us that impression. It was already a unanimous board vote that he stood behind. I think.
Which he didn't communicate with me during the.
Well, you know, regardless of whether, you know, the fact that you communicate something to someone and then they give you immediate displeasure, that may lead you to not maybe be totally at that point saying, oh, what's going on here? However, he said very clearly at the end of his testimony in front of this committee that were it not for the insertion of the governor and the commissioner and everybody in this process, that the speaker would be president of Good Will-Hinckley today. And that was his assessment, that it was only the threat of the withholding of the funds that led the board down that road. It was a domino effect. And I just wondered, how can your testimony be so different from his?
I can tell you, if you look at the report, his assessment of that lunch was that, I can find the exact words, but they were to the effect of, after meeting with me, he had the impression, well, this isn't insurmountable. So he walked away from my conversation with him thinking, you know, this isn't the end of the world. That what I communicated to him about what I thought were probably going to be the governor's feelings, and it turns out they were almost the same order, that he felt, walking away from the lunch, that it was not something that couldn't be overcome. So as far as how we both came away from the lunch, his impression, as he stated, was that, you know, this isn't the worst thing in the world. We can work with this. I'm paraphrasing. So that was my involvement with Jack for a long luncheon. Subsequently, he got impressions from people other than myself and a lot of others that changed his impression from the day we walked away from the lunch until later on. So I can only tell you that his testimony was we walked away from the lunch thinking, you know, this is not this is overcomable. This is not. Again, I see people paging through. I've forgotten the exact words he used, but this was not insurmountable. The governor's opposition, as he felt I had expressed it, was not insurmountable.
So your testimony today is that you never ever conveyed a threat to withhold the funding to Will-Hinckley if they continue to proceed with their unanimous vote to hire the Speaker of the House.
And again, I somewhat disengaged from the process because I was commissioner, not the policy that wasn't working in the governor's office. I never said to him, this is going to lead to the loss of the money. And I wouldn't have, because even after the governor said, I don't want them to get the money, I've on many occasions seen the governor a week or two later say, well, new information, things have changed, fine, go ahead and send them on. So I did not, and this was 2 hours after he had learned that it had become official. You know, I often change my mind too, so I was not of that mindset. And when I spoke, I didn't speak with Jack after that for a couple of weeks. We exchanged those few emails. And when I did communicate with him, he said, yeah, if the governor would be happier if the school was not run by Marquis. And I then added, or anybody else that is not qualified to run the school, not in the governor's point of view to run the school. I'm kind of expressing the governor's point of view, which is one from my head. I mean, from what the governor said, that was his point of view.
A couple of final questions. Was there any discussion, do you have any knowledge of what the actual selection process was? We've read about it in the report, but before that?
Not before. I read about it in the report, yeah.
And the governor, to your knowledge, did he have any knowledge of how the selection process had moved to the selection?
We didn't discuss. I think the outcome was to him revealing of surely I'm inferring what he might have been thinking, but surely a process that leads to this outcome could have been more about I'm assuming that's what he was thinking. It was the outcome, not the process, but we never discussed the process.
Let me just step back for a second. Because Mr. Moore couldn't have been clearer with us. Here's what happened. That the speaker is selected to be the new president. That there is now a threat from the administration that if the speaker continues, well, let me step back. That the governor learned that the speaker had been selected as president. That the governor expressed great displeasure with that and essentially said through you or through other members of the administration that if that continued, that the state support will be withdrawn. That then triggered the Harold Alpine Foundation to reconsider its own continuing commitment to see through its commitment to Good Will-Hinckley. And that pressured the school into rescinding its offer to hire the speaker. Let me suggest to you that that's essentially what he said. So where is the school getting this impression that the funding was going away, that the speaker would continue to be hired?
I don't know that he expressly explained that. I wasn't in their board meetings, privy to their discussions. I was involved at the beginning, and then the one phone call with Jack at the end. And, so I can't tell you why they got the impressions that they got.
Well, Mr. Moore never spoke directly to the governor, as far as we know. Mr. Moore got a handwritten note from the governor expressing displeasure about the hiring, but not threatening withdrawal of the funds. And the only people Mr. Moore spoke to were you and perhaps Mr. Chadbourne. I don't recall. But where else could Mr. Moore have gotten that impression?
I would have to look at the dates and times the governor made public statements about it. There were pretty clear impressions from there that don't have to come from myself or Mr. Chadbourne so I haven't built a timeline around when the governor was on radio or television expressing his points of view, or present for any of the meetings in Good Will-Hinckley where they said this is why we have this impression. I can only tell you what I said and how I said it, and how they took it. I can't. I'm not inside their head, so I can't respond.
Have you discussed your testimony here today with anybody else prior to today's hearing?
Other than my wife, no. She won't me to get her in.
Thank you. Other questions of Mr. Desjardins? Seeing none, thank you very much for your endurance and for being here. It's now 20 minutes of 1. Probably a good time to take a break. We're going to break just for 30 minutes. We're going to convene 10 minutes past 1 sharp.